Chapter 12:30. Taking advantage of Long Fei Ye's lingering affection, Han Yunxi pushed him away and turned to run away. Long Fei Ye let her run. Just as she was about to reach the shore, he waved his hand and created a wall of water, blocking Han Yunxi's escape route. She turned around and glared at him. "Can you be more naughty?" "Yes." Long Fei Ye was in such a good mood that he actually laughed out loud. He put down his hand, and the wall of water shattered into pieces. Han Yunxi's already drenched body became even more drenched. Her thin clothes clung tightly to her body and were basically transparent. All of her beauty and shyness couldn't be hidden. Long Fei Ye's burning gaze was already locked on her body, and he almost couldn't look away. Actually, he didn't want to be naughty at first. He just wanted to play with her and make a scene. He wanted to seriously ask for a daughter. But such a beautiful scene amidst the spiraling mist made him want to be naughty. He wanted to be naughty to the extreme. He said, "Han Yunxi, come over and admit defeat." Han Yunxi shook her head without even thinking. He was the one who had set a trap for her. She wasn't going to admit defeat. She walked into the depths of the water, hiding her seductive body. If she didn't hide, he would probably see through her. Long Fei Yi didn't move and let her go into the depths of the water. Han Yunxi's entire body was submerged in the hot water. Only her head was exposed. She looked at Long Fei Yi warily like a little rabbit, as if she was determined to go against him and not admit defeat. Long Fei Yi laughed out loud. This woman's behavior had conquered his desire to conquer her. "I'll ask you one last time. Do you admit defeat?" Long Fei Yi asked. "You tricked me," Han Yunxi protested. Long Fei Yi didn't know how to do that either. He suddenly dived into the water. Han Yunxi was experienced. She immediately dived into the water to guard against Long Fei Ye's sneak attack. Unfortunately, it was pitch black underwater and impossible to guard against. The waves on the surface of the pool were getting bigger, and they didn't know what was happening underwater. When Han Yunxi and Long Fei Yi emerged from the water, they were already on the other side of the pool, and the water was up to their necks. Han Yunxi's soaked clothes had already disappeared, revealing her fair, jade-like back and her beautiful collarbone. Long Fei Ye's clothes were still there. No matter what happened in the water, or how their fight went, Long Fei had won in the end. As the two of them faced each other, it was unclear what was happening beneath the water. Han Yunxi seemed to have been trapped in place as she didn't move, much less try to escape. Long Fei's smile was filled with amusement, but her expression was solemn. More accurately speaking, she was enduring silently. "Still not admitting defeat?" Long Fei asked next. "No," Han Yunxi answered immediately. The water rippled, and Han Yunxi was suddenly pulled over by Long Fei Yi. He looked at her and asked, "Are you admitting defeat?" Han Yunxi turned her head away and frowned. It was obvious that Long Fei Yi had bullied her a lot underwater. She leaned on his shoulder. Her body was obviously admitting defeat, but her mouth was still stubborn. "You tricked me, so I won't. I won't." Long Fei Ye's laughter became gentle. Do you believe that you won't even have the chance to admit defeat?" Underwater, just as Long Fei Yi was about to get up, Han Yunxi suddenly turned around and pushed Long Fei Yi to the shore. Long Fei's back slammed against the shore as he raised his arms to lean against the shore. He opened his chest to reveal his well-defined muscles. Han Yunxi came closer and looked at him fiercely. She said provocatively, "Do you believe that you'll have to admit defeat tonight?" Long Fei Yi didn't say anything. He just raised his eyebrows and looked at her. However, when Han Yunxi hugged his neck and raised her head to give herself to him, Long Fei Yi surrendered without saying anything or doing anything. She had tried this move many times, and he couldn't resist it at all. He kissed her consciously and waited for her to take the initiative. Sure enough, when he kissed her, she gave him the best response. No matter how naughty he was, he would be obedient and submissive as long as she kissed him. When she let go of him, there was no naughty look in his eyes, only gentleness. He said, Can you give me a daughter?" Han Yunxi burst out laughing. "So you're doing this for your daughter?" Long Fei Yi said in a low voice. "This time, it's for my daughter. Everything else is for you." "Once. Everything else." Han Yunxi was shocked. How many times did he want to do it? Before she could react, Long Fei Yi had already carried her in his arms and flew out of the tea pool to the tea room. It didn't matter who won or lost, because they had already become one with each other. In the middle of the night, it was New Year's Eve, and the beginning of the new year. Han Yunxi ended the past year in a deep sleep, due to exhaustion, and started a brand new year. God knows how much energy Long Fei Yi had. He carried the sleeping Han Yunxi into a warm fox fur coat, and carefully and gently wiped the water stains on her body. He didn't miss a single spot. He wrapped her in the warm bedding and let her rest on his lap. Then he helped her dry her wet hair and comb it until it was soft and smooth. Finally, he took a hairband and gently tied her hair into a bun. His head was bowed, his expression quiet, serious, and focused. He was a completely different person from the domineering man in the hibiscus tent. Besides Han Yunxi, no one else would ever know that this man who stood at the very top of Cloud Realm continent would personally style her hair in such a gentle manner after making love. Long Fei Yi placed Han Yunxi on the pillow and prepared to leave when Han Yunxi suddenly grabbed his hand and muttered in her sleep, I lost. Fei, I admit defeat. Long Fei broke into a soundless smile, the curve of his lips brilliant and beautiful. He couldn't help but reflect on his lack of sense of propriety and his fear of tormenting her. She had already admitted defeat to his domineering ways just then, but now she was admitting defeat again in her dreams. Idiot! Long Fei Yi couldn't help but lean over to kiss her. He even had the urge to bite down and wake her up for another round, but he held back. He didn't know how much love he had for her. Just like how he couldn't figure out how much he loved this woman. How deep. He placed her hand under the bedding and kissed her lightly on the lips before rising to his feet. Judging from past experiences, this woman wouldn't wake up until noon tomorrow. He couldn't sleep now because he still had to wait for little Rui to come back. Although he'd told Gu to take care of Rui and teach him a lesson, he'd also let Gu know that his precious son wasn't so easy to serve. But in the end, he couldn't bear to scare Rui all night. It was better to teach him a lesson. Long Fei Yi changed his clothes and draped a fox fur robe over his shoulders before leaving the tea house. He went all the way out of Narcissus' courtyard to find Rui personally. Su Donglin, who was guarding outside the courtyard, immediately appeared when he saw his master come out. Master, His Highness the Crown Prince, is at Shiha courtyard. This subordinate just came from there, and His Highness the Crown Prince had just fallen asleep. Gu hugged him to sleep and didn't put him on the bed. Long Fei Ye's face darkened in displeasure. Gu, this annoying fellow. Rui is already asleep and he still wants to hog him? Long Fei Yi strode toward Shiha courtyard, who knew that halfway there, he would hear the sound of a child crying in the distance. It's Rui. Long Fei Yi already knew that Rui would cry, but hearing the cries still made him anxious. He immediately used his qinggong to find him. As he approached, the cries grew louder and louder. Long Fei Yi was so anxious that he frowned. Soon he saw Gu hugging a wailing Rui and running towards him at a loss. Long Fei Yi, quick, take a look at Rui. What's wrong with him? I can't coax him no matter how I coax him. He was fine before, so he wasn't afraid of me. Gu was about to go crazy. Rui had clearly fallen asleep, but suddenly woke up and started crying as soon as he saw him, crying for his mother and father. He tried to coax him, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't calm him down. In the end, he could only carry him to Long Fei Yi and the rest. If he hadn't held him by force, Rui wouldn't have let him hold him at all. As a matter of fact, while Gu was talking to Long Fei Yi, Rui started wailing again. Sob sob mother, father mother father. Long Fei's heart ached at the sight of his tear-streaked face as he struggled for his life. He almost ran forward to give him a hug, but he didn't. He stood in place and told Chu Shifeng, go find Zhao Mama quick. Currently, the wailing Rui had no idea that his father was right in front of him. He struggled with all his might until he suddenly bit down viciously on Gu's hand. Rui had already lost 6 teeth, so of course he was in pain. But Gu didn't feel the pain at all. His heart was burning with impatience. He yelled at Long Fei Yi. What are you spacing out for? Take him away. Put him down. Long Fei Yi said. Gu refused. How could he put Rui down when he was already in such a state? The ground was covered in snow, so Ru'er would definitely roll around in the snow as soon as he set him down. Gu strode over and handed Ru'er to Long Fei Yi, but Long Fei Yi backed away. Normally, Ru'er would cry in his arms, much less now. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but that he couldn't. Gu shoved Ru'er into Long Fei Yi's arms, who immediately backed away. Only then did Ru'er realize that his father was here. He looked at his father with teary eyes and suddenly cried even louder. Long Fei Yi, what are you doing? Even a strict father shouldn't be like this. How old is he? Gu was furious. Seeing that Ru'er had discovered his father, he simply set him down. Ru'er, go find your father. Go. If your father doesn't want you, Godfather will take you away right now. We'll go far, far away and never come back. Ru'er didn't roll to the ground, but stood in place with his hands clenched into fists. His large, red eyes stared pitifully at Long Fei Yi. Father, sob, father. Father. The more he looked, the more he cried. He cried so hard that he almost melted himself. No one knew how much Long Fei Yi's heart hurt at this moment. He didn't know what to do with this son of his. Finally, Gu was puzzled. What's wrong with Ru'er? If she was crying for her father, shouldn't she be running into Long Fei's arms instead? Why is Ru'er standing in place? Why is he looking at Long Fei Yi so pitifully and innocently? Suddenly, Long Fei Yi roared at the shadow guard beside him. Where's Su Donglin? If you don't bring Granny Zhao here, I'll cripple him. Ru'er actually ran to him and hugged his legs. Father. Father, hug. Long Fei Yi was stunned. It had been almost a year, but his son had never taken the initiative to approach him, let alone ask for a hug. Chapter 1231. Long Fei Yi didn't know how to react to Ru'er's request for a hug. This was the first time since his son was born. This was also the hope he had hidden deep in his heart. Even Han Yunxi might not understand. He had never been hugged by his father, and the number of times he had been hugged by his mother could be counted on one hand. Even if there were, it was just a hug and a pat on his shoulder. Perhaps he was destined to be a child who wasn't loved, a child who had to grow up early. However, this didn't stop him from hugging and doting on Ru'er. It was because he had experienced it that he understood the child's desire and hoped to give it to him. Ru'er cried even louder when he saw that his father wasn't moving. He grabbed his father's robe and stepped on it, rubbing against his father's body. Finally, Long Fei recovered his wits and scooped up Ru'er in his arms. If he could, he'd melt the boy into his flesh. How much love did he have for him? Daddy's here. Don't be afraid. Good boy. Daddy's here. In the dark night, no one noticed that Long Fei Yi's eyes were filled with tears. Ru'er really stopped crying, unlike before when he was hugged in his father's arms. Ru'er's little hands wrapped tightly around his father's neck. He lowered his head and buried it in his father's chest. Gu didn't know what to say as he watched from the side. He could only sigh inwardly. In the end, he was someone else's son. Ru'er had stopped crying, but Long Fei Yi sensed that Ru'er was trembling in fear. Although Long Fei dearly wanted to hold Ru'er a little longer and let him lean on him, he was rational towards the boy and cold towards himself. He immediately pulled Ru'er out of his arms. Ru'er looked up, and he saw Ru'er biting his lips tightly with a face full of fear. Now Gu Qixiao noticed something strange as well. How could this be? Ru'er, what's wrong? Tell Daddy that you can talk to Daddy properly. Don't be afraid. Long Fei Yi asked seriously. Ru'er looked at him and didn't say anything for a long time. His eyes were filled with tears, and he was still in a daze. Good girl, tell me why? What are you afraid of? Long Fei Yi asked again. Ru'er's trembling intensified. His expression was one of unimaginable fear. Long Fei's heart clenched at the sight. Long Fei Yi remained patient and asked seriously, Ru'er, are you afraid of Daddy? Tell me yes or no. Ru'er bit his lip and didn't say anything, but he shook his head without hesitation. Long Fei Yi had asked Ru'er more than once, but Ru'er always shook his head. Regardless of whether he was awake during the day or at night, he would always shake his head when he was crying in a daze. But his most instinctive reaction was clearly fear. Then what are you afraid of? Long Fei Yi was so anxious that he forgot that Ru'er wasn't completely awake at this moment. This was a mess. The child's consciousness wasn't clear, and he wouldn't remember when he woke up tomorrow. Ruaer didn't make a sound. He stared at his father, his teary eyes full of innocence and fear. However, he reached out again and hugged his father's neck tightly, as if he would never let go. Long Feiyi knew that he should push Ruaer away, but he couldn't resist in the end. He hugged Ruaer for a while, his large hands protecting Ruaer in his embrace. Even if the sky fell, he would hold it up for Ruaer forever. When Ruaer was awake, it was instinctive for him to cry and be afraid in his arms. But when he was messing around in the middle of the night without a clear consciousness, all his reactions were the most realistic and instinctive reactions. So Ruaer wanted him to hug him. When Ruaer was awake, how much did he endure because of that inexplicable fear? Just like himself in the past, looking at his cold and heartless mother, his only relative, how much did he endure? That feeling of forbearance was like suffering. Enduring until he grew up. Enduring until he didn't lose that desire. However, back then, he had never thought that his father and mother would leave him before he could even grow up. They had left him forever. The people left behind only recognized his identity as the East Qing Crown Prince, treating him as someone who wouldn't be sad or miss, placing all the responsibilities of his father and mother on his shoulders. From that time on, he lived alone, cold and lonely, because he only had subordinates, no family, no relatives. Long Feiyi hadn't thought about the past for more than 10 years. He buried his head in Ruaer's shoulder and planted a heavy kiss on Ruaer's body. He swore in a low voice, "Xianyuan Ruaer, don't be afraid. Daddy won't leave, Daddy will always wait for you. Wait until you're not afraid of Daddy anymore." After he said this, he resolutely pulled away Ruaer's hand and handed him to Zhao Mama, who had just arrived. Although Ruaer was tightly hugging him, he was trembling very hard. There must be a reason for this. If he let Ruaer continue to be afraid, he didn't know what would happen. He could only be ruthless. Zhao Mama hugged Ruaer, but who would have thought that Ruaer would continue to cry? Granny Zhao didn't know what to do. Apart from father and mother, little master only wanted her at night. Actually, Zhao Mama had been guarding the little master the entire time to prevent him from making a fuss. When he woke up and saw Gu, she had just left because she had something to do. "Little master, look at this old servant, it's Zhao Mama. Look at this. Little master, wake up. It's morning, it's time to wake up." Zhao Mama coaxed him while signaling Su Donglin to bring the lantern closer and shine it on the little master's face. A naughty child couldn't be comforted, only sober him up. Helpless Ruaer still cried. Just like when he was in Gu's arms, he cried and struggled with all his might. Ruaer was so strong that Zhao Mama couldn't even hold him while standing. In a moment of carelessness, Ruaer slipped down. As soon as Ruaer slid down, he turned and pounced on Long Feiyi, hugging his legs tightly. He cried and begged, "Daddy, I want Daddy. Daddy, carry me." This scene made Granny Zhao cry. Su Donglin turned his head away, not daring to look. He secretly wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes. The more Gu watched, the more distressed and confused he felt. He huffed and urged, "Long Feiyi, what are you doing? If you don't carry him, I'll take him away." Gu couldn't wait to rush over and protect Ruaer in his arms. Long Feiyi looked down at his son and kept rubbing his little head, finally sighing softly. He didn't say anything and picked up Ruaer. Using Qinggong, he quickly flew in the direction of Narcissus' courtyard. Ruaer didn't cry along the way, but his trembling didn't stop. Long Feiyi knew very well that after this, he wouldn't carry Ruaer again unless Ruaer was no longer afraid of him. He especially wanted the road to Narcissus' courtyard to be longer and longer. But what was the use of a long road? He was very fast and arrived at Narcissus' courtyard in a short while. He carried Ruaer to the warm tea room. Ruaer seemed to be asleep. He didn't cry or make a fuss, only trembling in his arms. Long Feiyi's furrowed brows hadn't relaxed since just now. He placed Ruaer on the bed. Ruaer sniffed the familiar scent and saw his mother. He whimpered and crawled to his mother's side. He found a place to lie down next to his mother, stuck his little butt up, and put his face on the blanket. He quieted down. He seemed sad and aggrieved. After a moment of silence, he sniffled and whimpered a few more times before completely quieting down and falling asleep. At this moment, Ruaer didn't have the temper he had during the day. He was cold and aloof, just like a clingy little bug. Long Fei stood at the side and watched. He looked at Rui'er's pure lotus-like face and Han Yunqi's sleeping face. He was clearly sad and helpless, but the corner of his mouth couldn't help but curl into a faint smile. It was warmth and happiness. Many times, suffering was only because of loneliness. If one had loved ones by their side, no matter how difficult it was, it wouldn't be difficult, right? Long Fei found a blanket and carefully covered Rui'er with it. He sat down beside Rui'er and Han Yunqi and leaned against the high pillow. Long Fei never got tired of looking at the mother and son's sleeping faces. As he watched, he fell into deep thought. Originally, seeing that Rui'er was normal in all aspects, he and Han Yunqi planned to wait for another year and a half. Perhaps Rui'er would be able to tell them the reason when he grew up. But tonight, looking at his helpless son, his heart felt like it was being torn apart. It hurt so much that even breathing was difficult. Gu Beiwei once said that this might have something to do with the murderous aura on his body. The stronger the internal energy, the stronger the murderous aura. Children were the most sensitive, and Rui'er might be too sensitive. Perhaps he had to make a trip to Sky Mountain, or find a way to meet Han Chen. Han Chen might know more about the lust-bite power than his master. On New Year's Eve, Long Fei leaned against his wife and son, and unknowingly fell asleep. Tang Li was also sleeping peacefully beside his wife and daughter. The snow was getting heavier and heavier. Number 7 tea house was silent. Only the whistling of the north wind could be heard. Gu had already returned to Shiha courtyard. At this moment he was soaking in the tea pool. Leaning against the shore, he raised his head and casually spread his arms out on the shore. The tea reached his chest. His body had recovered for more than a year. His chest muscles were well defined, and his shoulders and back were well defined. He was so sexy that it caused one's imagination to run wild. Coupled with his gorgeous face, he was simply the best of evildoers. He closed his eyes, allowing the snow to fall on his face and shoulders. Before the snow covered his entire face, he chuckled. Another year. The first year is over, haha. Another year had passed. His age could be increased. The first year of his rebirth. There would be many more years in the future. Number 7 tea house returned to the silence of night. At this moment, Gu Beiwei had just returned to his residence. After the founding of the country, Gu Beiwei was the busiest of all the civil and military officials in the court. Thanks to these months of busyness, he had some free time in the coming days. After all, the crown prince was still too young and couldn't be considered sensible. There wasn't much that needed teaching. The Imperial Academy of Medicine had been rebuilt, and all the positions had been properly assigned. As for the matter of merging Medical City and Medicine City, under the Imperial Academy of Medicine's jurisdiction, it was an important matter that couldn't be rushed. He was still preparing. He used Qin Min's poor health as an excuse to ask for leave from Long Fei and take Qin Min to the south. Chapter 1232. Gu Beiwei took Qin Min to the south and bought a quiet small house in Ningzhou, a famous city in the south of the Yangtze River, and lived there. Except for their personal servants, they didn't hire any other servants. In this house, Qin Min didn't have to stuff clothes in her belly and pretend to be pregnant like in Yuning. She didn't have to pretend to be disabled and sit in a wheelchair all the time. Everything had become much more relaxed. Other than the young maidservant by her side, no one else knew how much she wanted to run around after her legs recovered. In Yuning, the Gu mansion had all kinds of scruples. Moreover, with Gu Beiwei's cautious character, she didn't dare to be presumptuous, so she could only endure. Hiding the truth about her legs and continuing to sit in a wheelchair was both her idea and Gu Beiwei's idea. She wanted to find out who did this to her, and Gu Beiwei wanted to find out the mole in the Qin family and take the opportunity to change the situation of the several families in the medical city. Although Gu Beiwei was the director, it was not easy to take the medical college under the jurisdiction of the imperial court. He needed an opportunity and the support of the several families in the medical city, whether voluntary or forced. Back in Yuning's Gu estate, she had to put on a show sometimes, so she and Gu Beiwei interacted more often. Now that they were in Ningzhou, she and Gu Beiwei had gone their separate ways. Gu Beiwei was a very quiet person, in front of people and behind closed doors. She was different. She liked quiet, but she didn't like noisy people. She was silent in front of people. She knew everything in her heart, but she didn't say it out loud. She didn't argue. She pretended to be stupid and kept a low profile. In private, she was not a quiet and gentle woman, but a very troublesome person. She liked to study acupuncture and could make her own gold needles. She liked to plant flowers and plants in the yard and didn't mind getting mud all over. She liked to decorate the room clean and beautiful and occasionally change the furnishings. She liked to make pastries by herself and stayed in the kitchen for the whole afternoon. She liked to play the zither and paint. Recently she even learned to dance. She was a person full of love for life. She liked quiet, but could live a lively life in her independent small world. She treated people very well, but she also had a temper. When she was serious, her temper was not small. Her temperament looked very similar to Gu Beiyue's, but in reality, they were very different. Gu Beiyue was so quiet that it made her feel bored. She also knew that her living habits might disturb Gu Beiyue. In Yuning's house, she always put Gu Beiyue first and tried her best not to disturb him. After all, he was her husband. He was the luckiest and safest home in her life. He was the benefactor who had saved her from the Qin family. In Ningzhou she was much more at ease. For one thing, no acquaintances came to visit or disturb them. She and Gu Beiyue didn't give face to the local officials in Ningzhou. They didn't want to see them. Secondly, the mansion in Ningzhou wasn't big, but it had 2 independent courtyards. She and Gu Beiyue didn't have much to worry about. From the first day they moved in, they each lived in one courtyard and lived their own lives. The day before New Year's Eve, Gu Beiyue said that he would come over to have dinner with her. Qin Min also happened to be going over to invite him. The two looked at each other and smiled. Gu Beiyue said, "Come over when it's dark. Something simple is fine. There's no need to prepare too much." Qin Min said jokingly, "Can I buy some fireworks to pay for the meal?" Gu Beiyue smiled and agreed. Qin Min prepared a table of dishes. There wasn't much, but all of them were her best dishes. She waited for Gu Beiyue, with the attitude of a friend from the medical community, who shared the same ideals. After her legs were crippled, she no longer had any friends. The only person she could talk to was the little maidservant beside her. Unfortunately, when it was dark, Gu Beiyue's servant came over and said that Gu Beiyue had an urgent matter and had gone out. Qin Min waited until it was late at night. Gu Beiyue came over alone. His figure was like a shadow as he silently landed outside the house. He saw that the door was open, and the dishes on the table had turned cold. Qin Min was lying on the table and sleeping. Her maidservant was leaning against a pillar at the side, dozing off. Gu Beiyue entered and saw that the dishes on the table had not been touched. He frowned. At this time, the maidservant woke up in a daze. When she saw him, she exclaimed, "Son-in-law." Qin Min immediately raised her head and stared at Gu Beiyue with sleepy eyes, a little dazed. "Eldest Miss Qin, I'm sorry to have kept you waiting for so long," Gu Beiyue said gently. Qin Min regained her senses this time. She patted her face and hurriedly got up. "Headmaster, don't stand on ceremony. You haven't eaten yet, right?" She asked the maidservant to quickly heat up the dishes. Gu Beiyue did not stop her. When the maidservant finished heating up the dishes, Gu Beiyue said, "I've eaten outside. You should eat. It's New Year's Eve. If you don't eat, you'll starve for a year." Qin Min was stunned. Then she burst out laughing. "Headmaster, you believe this is a lie to a child?" Gu Beiyue personally scooped a bowl of soup and handed it to her. He said mildly, "I'll sit with you for a while. You should eat. Since you're already here to eat, you can't miss the appointment." Was Gu Beiyue worried that she would not eat and persuaded her mother? Qin Min chuckled and said honestly, "Even if you don't eat, I'll eat. I'm really hungry. This is fresh mushroom soup. After heating it up, the taste is much worse, but it's still quite good. Do you want to try a bowl?" Gu Beiyue was slightly stunned. His gaze fell on Qin Min's face. Only then did Qin Min retract her smile. She realized that she might have said too much. It was strange. She was always very calm and collected in front of others. Why couldn't she remain calm in front of Gu Beiyue? Qin Min thought that she must have been dazed from sleep. She secretly told herself that she should be more careful in the future. After all, they lived together. It would be bad to disturb this great benefactor's peace. Gu Beiwei only felt that Qin Min seemed a little different from usual. However, he couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. Qin Min thanked him and lowered her head to drink the soup quietly. She didn't dare to look at him again. "Eldest Miss Qin, I will set off for Medical City tomorrow," Gu Beiwei said mildly. "I just went out to see a patient. The situation is complicated and dangerous. I plan to personally send him to Medical City and hand him over to Deputy Shun." Qin Min raised her head and nodded seriously. Gu Beiwei had only asked for a month and a half's leave. It was a long journey from Ningzhou to Medical City. Moreover, he couldn't walk fast with a patient. Such a round trip would take more than a month and a half. "Be careful on the way. If time is tight, you don't have to come back. Go directly to Yuning," Qin Min said seriously. "I will arrange the child's matter properly. Don't worry." They were going south this time to give birth to a child. Gu Beiwei adopted a baby boy who was almost 1 year old. It didn't match the time of her fake birth. There was a difference of nearly a year. Gu Beiwei planned to let her give birth in the south, and then let her stay in Jiangnan to recuperate until the child was a little older. When he was 3 or 4 years old, he would take him back to Yuning. After all, it was difficult to tell the child's age between 3 and 5 years old. Gu Beiwei promised that in the next few years, he would definitely let her find the person who poisoned the Qin family. Qin Min was also happy with such an arrangement. She could be free for a few years. When she returned to Yuning, she didn't have to pretend to be pregnant or lame. She could also work in the medical school. Her life wouldn't be so restrained. "Thank you for your hard work," Gu Beiwei said politely. "It's my duty," Qin Min said with a smile. Gu Beiwei didn't stay for long. Qin Min hadn't even finished a bowl of soup when he was about to leave. "It's cold outside. I won't send you off. Rest early," Gu Beiwei said lightly. Qin Min was quite indifferent at first, but for some reason, when she saw Gu Beiwei's lonely figure walking away, she couldn't help but chase after him. "Let's send you off. It's New Year's Eve." Gu Beiwei didn't refuse. The two of them walked side by side and quietly walked to the gate. "Miss Qin, please wait," Gu Beiwei said lightly. "Director, have a safe trip," Qin Min said seriously. Gu Beiwei had already left, but he turned back and said, "Miss Qin, I brought the fireworks. They're on the coffee table in your room." Qin Min waved her hand and said politely, "Thank you." Seeing that Gu Beiwei's figure had disappeared into the cold night, Qin Min put down her hand and muttered to herself, "He didn't even eat. Why did he leave money for the meal?" She returned to her room, and indeed saw the fireworks that Gu Beiwei had left behind. She was stunned for a moment, then suddenly became anxious. "Xiaoyao, quick, bring me a lighter. Let's go set off the fireworks." She was so anxious that she turned and ran. She accidentally tripped over the threshold and fell heavily to the ground. Seeing this, the maidservant Xiaoyao hurried over to help her up. "Miss, what's wrong? Where did you fall? Does it hurt?" She got up and, ignoring the pain, snatched the maidservant's lighter and ran into the courtyard. Soon she lit the fireworks. Following the popping sounds, gorgeous flowers bloomed in the sky. She stood under the sky full of fireworks, looking up and smiling. "So beautiful." Gu Beiwei hadn't gone far yet. He looked back and saw the resplendent fireworks in the sky. It was gorgeous and beautiful. He paused until all the fireworks were gone, then turned to leave. How long would it be before they could meet again after this parting? Gu Beiwei gradually walked away. Qin Min stood in the courtyard and stared blankly at the ashes on the ground. Xiaoyao pulled her over and looked her up and down. "Miss, where were you hurt just now? Does it hurt?" "Miss, your leg has just recovered. You can't fall." "Miss, why are you so anxious?" Qin Min let Xiaoyao nag for a long time before she looked over and muttered, "Xiaoyao, I can't bear to part with him." Xiaoyao was stunned for a moment before replying, "Miss, this servant can't bear to part with the son-in-law either. It's the new year. The son-in-law is really a good person." Qin Min stared at Xiaoyao for a long time. Finally, she smiled helplessly and returned to her room without saying anything else. "Xiaoyao, this silly girl. There was a dinner and fireworks. Gu Beiwei and Qin Min could be considered to have passed New Year's Eve. There was one person's New Year's Eve that didn't have a dinner or fireworks, only wine. This person was none other than Ning Cheng, who had been missing for a long time. On the grassland north of Wintercrow Country, a bonfire burned fiercely, its flames soaring into the sky. The men of Wintercrow Country weren't afraid of the cold. They were all wearing fox skin vests and gathered around the bonfire, drinking and eating meat. Ning Cheng was among them. His attire wasn't much different from the men of Wintercrow Country, and his strength was no different from the men of Wintercrow Country. The only difference was that the men of Wintercrow Country ate meat, while Ning Cheng only drank. If one didn't look carefully, no one would be able to tell that this guy was the master of the D clan, the former great general of the north. While they drank and drank, female slaves emerged from the surrounding tents. One of them sat down by Ning Cheng's side. Chapter 1233. The female slave by Ning Cheng's side had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a fiery figure. She didn't look like a member of the Wintercrow clan, but more like a member of the Tanta clan from the west of the mysterious continent. It wasn't strange for the Wintercrow clan's slave traders to set foot in the mysterious continent. Unlike Cloud Realm continent, which forbade slave trading, the mysterious continent was free to do so. Slaves were different from servants. Slaves were never free, but their masters could use them for free. They could kill as they pleased, and their children would remain slaves forever. Servants, on the other hand, were paid wages and could leave as soon as their contracts were up. Slave trading was a lucrative business. Supposedly, Ning Cheng understood that the Wintercrow clan's biggest slave traders weren't from their own clan, but from the mysterious continent. Ning Cheng had headed south after leaving northern Li to tour Jiangnan. He wanted to visit all of the famous wineries there before picking a good place to open his own. But who knew? Long Feiyi had actually taken control of all of Cloud Realm continent's biggest wineries. Now he couldn't open a winery, nor find a place to drink good wine. He knew that Long Feiyi was forcing him to show himself, but he refused. If he'd tricked Long Feiyi with that bet, he was more than willing to bear the infamy of going back on his word, and have the Long Feiyi bear a grudge for the rest of his life. Without wine to drink, he could only head north and escape Long Feiyi's sphere of influence to Wintercrow Country. Wintercrow Country's wines were all strong liquors to his liking. Since he was already in the Wintercrow clan, he had nothing better to do, so he started to investigate Goldie's background. In just a few months, he got together with the biggest slave merchant in the Wintercrow clan, Le Zheng. Le Zheng came from the mysterious continent and was a martial arts trash. He couldn't survive there, so he joined the Lubei Trade Consortium in his 20s to engage in slave trading. Now he was in his 60s, but he was still unmarried and had no children. In recent years he'd been searching for a successor. If it was anyone else, they might not be able to win Le Zheng's favor even after years of effort. But Ning Cheng was still the master of Cloud Realm Trade Consortium. He had both money and business acumen, so it wasn't difficult for him to win Le Zheng's favor. The grassland Ning Cheng was in was within Le Zheng's sphere of influence. At this moment, Le Zheng was sitting across from Ning Cheng, looking at him in a drunken stupor. The dozen or so people around him were Le Zheng's trusted subordinates. Ning Cheng was not interested in the slave trade. Back then, Ning Cheng had half-jokingly offered to work with him to resell slaves. He had also proposed to expand his business to the mysterious continent, but Ning Cheng had not agreed. Although Le Zheng's slave trade was very profitable, and he could use this opportunity to make friends with many influential people on the mysterious continent, Ning Cheng was not interested at all. Without the D-clan's mission, he felt much more at ease. No matter how big a business empire he wanted, he could build it with his own hands. There was no need to take other people's plates. He found the man who'd sold Jean Z out of Wintercrow Country, then followed the man's trail, and found something suspicious. If it was Wintercrow Country slaves, they'd usually come from small slave traders who bought their goods from various slave owners. Then they'd be sold to larger slave traders, who would then sell them out of Wintercrow Country to Cloud Realm Continent, or the mysterious continent. Most of these slaves were from Wintercrow Country. Wintercrow country was a nation of slaves. 2/3 of the population were slaves. Slaves would always be slaves, and so would their descendants. They had no chance to change their fortunes, because they were branded with the mark of a slave as soon as they were born. As long as their masters didn't need them, they'd write out an indenture contract to sell them off as well. Another group of slaves came from Cloud Realm continent, or the mysterious continent. They were either abducted, adopted, or sold off for other reasons. These people would come to Wintercrow country and sell them to slave owners. Once they were branded with Wintercrow country's unique slave mark, they'd be sold off for a different price. Generally speaking, both Wintercrow country slaves and foreign slaves would only be bought and sold 3 or 4 times between Wintercrow country slave traders and slave traders. But Ning Chung discovered that Jean Zi's indenture contracts had been sold between Wintercrow country slave traders and slave traders a total of 10 times. At first, Jean Zi had been sold from one of Yu Jing's subordinates, Uncle Gong. But Uncle Gong didn't know which slave owner he'd bought Jean Zi from, and which slave owner had opened Jean Zi's indenture contract. Ning Chung couldn't find any clues. Now that Uncle Gong had passed away, Ning Chung had snuck into the Liu Bei Trade Consortium. He investigated all of Uncle Gong's slave trades, but didn't find any clues. At the same time, he searched through all of Wintercrow country, but didn't find a second person who understood the language of beasts. He began to suspect that Jean Zi wasn't a member of Wintercrow country, but someone from the mysterious continent. Uncle Gong's previous records must have been destroyed by someone else. There had to be something fishy going on here. If he wanted to find out Jean Zi's true identity, he had to figure out how Jean Zi had been sold to Wintercrow country as a slave. It was late at night, and everyone was drunk. Ning Chung seemed to be drunk as well, but he was actually very sober. Yu Zheng had rewarded everyone with Wintercrow girls as a reward, but he'd given Ning Chung a girl from another race. Whether it was a special benefit or a test, no one knew. The blonde beauty seemed to know Ning Chung's preferences well. She picked up a jar of wine as soon as she arrived and downed it with a tilt of her head. The people around them looked over and started to jeer. Ning Chung sat on the ground and leaned back. He arched an eyebrow as he watched the beauty drink with great interest. Even if he was blind in one eye and wore a blindfold, it didn't make him look handsome or noble at all. That eye alone could easily captivate people's souls when he was bewitching. His evil smile mesmerized all of the female slaves present. The blonde beauty finished the wine and smashed the jar to pieces. She rested one hand on Ning Cheng's shoulder, while the other picked up a jug of wine. Slowly, she drew closer to Ning Cheng's body, her enchanting figure and seductive movements drawing whistles from the crowd. Ning Cheng glanced at the jeering crowd and smiled even more brilliantly. He yelled, "Drink!" As soon as he raised his head and opened his mouth, the blonde beauty straddled him and poured the wine into his mouth. Ning Cheng drank in large mouthfuls, letting the overflowing wine wet his face, hair, and clothes. He was carefree and unrestrained. Soon the jar was empty. The blonde beauty had just tossed the jar away when Ning Chung, who had been leaning back, suddenly leaned forward and pushed the blonde beauty to the ground. The screams and whistles around them grew even louder. The drunk Le Zheng also laughed out loud. Good alcohol tolerance. Ning Chung looked over and casually grabbed a jar of wine and threw it over. Even if the other people present were too drunk, they wouldn't dare to be so rude to Le Zheng. But Ning Chung dared. Le Zheng caught the wine and happily drank it in large mouthfuls. Ning Cheng's attention returned to the blonde beauty. The corner of his mouth hooked up into a devilish arc. He grabbed the wine and poured it into the beauty's mouth. His action catered to the wicked taste of the people present. The jeering became louder and louder. After the blonde beauty was poured a jar of wine, she was completely drunk. Like an octopus, she clung onto Ning Chung and didn't let go. Her hand reached into Ning Cheng's clothes, as if she wanted to undress him. Ning Chung purposely pried her hand away and gave a drunken burp. Beauty, there's no rush. Hee hee, this gentleman will definitely serve you well tonight, he said drunkenly. As he spoke, he got up and held the blonde beauty's waist with one hand and lifted a jar of wine with the other. He waved at Le Zheng and turned to walk towards the tent not far away. Le Zheng laughed and hugged a female slave, letting his brothers continue to drink. After a while, everyone returned with beauties in their arms and dispersed. At this time, a tall and slender young woman quietly walked into the tent where Le Jung was staying. Le Jung wasn't drunk. The female slave he brought in kneeled behind him and massaged him. Under the light, this young woman was dressed in black. She had a pretty face and a pair of iconic red phoenix eyes. She was very beautiful. She was none other than Le Zheng's most beloved goddaughter, the eldest miss of Lubei Chamber of Commerce, Lulu. Many people who didn't know the situation thought that Lulu was Le Zheng's biological daughter. She let the female slave leave and personally massaged her godfather. "Father, the female slave I arranged for Ah Chung is pretty good, right?" Lulu asked. Ning Qing entered Lubei Chamber of Commerce as an orphan. He didn't have a surname, only a given name. Everyone called him Ah Chung. Whether she's good or not, we'll know after he uses her. Haha. Le Zheng laughed. Lila laughed. Don't all men like that? I guarantee that Ning Qing will keep her. I'll sell one to father. If it's not good, I'll pay you 3 times the price. If it's good, I'll sell father some tonics, so that father and grandfather won't tire themselves out and hurt their bodies. You little girl, you might as well be a brothel keeper. Le Zheng pulled Lulu in front of him and scolded her with a frown. If you continue to be so mischievous, be careful that you won't be able to get married. Le Zheng trusted Ning Qing completely, but Lulu was still on guard against him. Thus, he arranged for someone to stay by his side and keep an eye on him. In order to guarantee that Ning Qing would keep the female slave, Lil especially found the blonde beauty Shaikyu. Shaikyu was not only beautiful, but also good in bed. It's good that I can't get married. Father can give Lubei Chamber of Commerce to me. Father can enjoy life. I promise to show filial piety to father every year. Lula said happily. One had to know that in Lubei Chamber of Commerce, there were countless people who wanted to control this business, but they didn't dare to show it. Lulu, however, never avoided it. Perhaps it was because she dared to think, speak, and act that Le Zheng loved her dearly. Le Zheng pulled Lily's hand and patted it gently. He said earnestly, "Daughter, father wants to ask you seriously. How is Ah Chung?" "Everything is good except that he's blind in one eye. His background is unknown," Lulu answered without thinking. "If we find out his background and prove that he has no disloyalty to Lubei Chamber of Commerce, are you willing to marry him?" Le Zheng asked again. Le Zheng wanted to pass the business to Lulu, but Lulu was a woman. Those in the slave trade were mostly men. Lulu would more or less be at a disadvantage if she dealt with those men. If she could marry Ah Chung, the two of them could take over Lubei Chamber of Commerce. Then he could rest assured and return to his original family. After leaving home for decades, he would eventually return to his roots. Le Zheng hadn't taken a wife for so many years because his family had extremely high requirements for bloodline. Even if he was a good-for-nothing, he couldn't marry a woman from the mysterious continent. Lila thought for a moment and said with a grin, "Sure, I'll ask Shakia later. If Ah Chung is a good man, I'll consider it." Chapter 1234. Lulu. Le Zheng snapped angrily. Could it be that his daughter hung out with a bunch of men every day and got used to dirty jokes? Why wasn't she ashamed at all? Lulu wasn't afraid of Le Zheng's anger. She laughed. "Daddy, I won't disturb you anymore. I'm going to set off the fireworks." At this time, Ning Qing had already drunk Shaikyu. He bent down and was about to tear off Shaikyu's clothes when he seemed to think of something. He got up and slashed Shaikyu's clothes with his sword energy. Then, he tossed the bedding over without even looking at Shaikyu. He lay down on the warm couch and closed his eyes to rest. But not long after, the fireworks outside the window woke him up. He looked at the fireworks that were constantly blooming and disappearing, and gradually fell into deep thought. He thought that Le Zheng wouldn't use this method to test him. This slave Shaikyu must be Miss Lily's servant. Uncle Gong had passed away. The slave trade that Uncle Gong personally handled was all big business. Only Le Zheng knew the accounts. If Jean Zi's background wasn't simple, then Le Zheng would definitely remember it. Ning Qing didn't dare to alert Le Zheng before he fully gained his trust. He knew that in the coming days, he would have to deal with Shaikyu and Shaikyu's master, Lulu. On New Year's Eve, He suddenly thought of Jinzi. He worked so hard for Jinzi. If Jinzi, that cold-hearted guy, knew, would he be touched? In fact, if it weren't for the wine, he might not have stayed for long. Of course, Jinzi didn't know what Ningcheng did for him. He also didn't know that Ningcheng was in the Winter Crow tribe that he had yearned for many years. In such a cold night he was still on his way. Northern Li still needed food aid from the south this winter. This winter was also cold. Many places in the north of Northern Li had snow disasters. Many roads were buried in snow. So, even if there was enough food, it couldn't be delivered to the victims. 2 months ago, Han Yunqi sent elite troops from the Western Army, Bailey Army, and Southern Army to Northern Li to help the Ning Army and the Black Clan Army with disaster relief. She also announced that after disaster relief, there would be a big reward. Although the various military factions fought fiercely in secret, everyone was still united and cooperated with each other in Northern Li. However, it was New Year's Eve, and they still had to clear the road and transport the food through the snow. It was inevitable that some of the soldiers who were sent out would complain. Jinzi had been tired for a few days. Originally, he wanted to take advantage of the New Year's Eve to sleep in his tent. However, when he heard that the soldiers who complained were from the Bailey military faction, and that there were signs of trouble, he couldn't sleep. At the beginning of the country, there were many things waiting to be done. Most of the money in the imperial court was used on the blade. Part of the food for the disaster relief in Northern Li was donated by Long Fei Ye's own granary, and the other part was donated by the grain merchants in Jiangnan and the central region under Long Fei Ye's compulsion. Because of this incident, the Southern Army requested to lead the disaster relief operation in Northern Li, but it was rejected by Long Fei Yi in the end. Jinzi knew about Bailey Yuanlong's collusion with the Southern Army. He had followed Ningcheng for more than a year, so he was well aware of the secret struggles between the various military factions. He knew very well that if he didn't personally make an appearance tonight and keep an eye on those people, even a small matter would be stirred up into a big dispute and cause a huge commotion. Then, this New Year's Eve would be lively in the military. Jinzi personally picked up the shovel and shoveled the snow with the soldiers. He personally pulled the carriage carrying the food forward on foot. With this, who would dare complain behind his back? After crossing the hill, everyone stopped to rest. A soldier brought over hot water. "General, it's hot. It'll get cold in a while." Jinzi drank a few mouthfuls and let the soldier drink it himself. The soldier immediately left, not daring to stay by his side for too long. They rested for a while before leaving, so there was no need to light a fire. The weather wasn't good either, so everyone huddled together to keep each other warm. Jinzi was the only one who stood far away. He leaned against the carriage and wrapped his cloak tightly around himself. His head was lowered. His short hair and shoulders were covered in snow. He was especially thin and stood there quietly, aloof and mysterious. He didn't look like a general at all. In the military, he was actually more intimidating than Ningcheng. If Ningcheng was here, there would be some people in the Ning family army who would rely on their seniority to take advantage of their seniority. However, when he stood in the army, no one dared to make a sound. Because no one was familiar with him, they didn't understand him and couldn't figure him out. He raised a group of tiger army consisting of more than 10 big tigers. Although he didn't usually take them out for a stroll, everyone remembered and was afraid of him. They didn't dare to easily approach him. The bone-chilling northern wind rose again, blowing away the snowflakes on Jinzi's hair and shoulders. It also made his cloak billow in the wind. Everyone felt cold and hugged the people around them tighter. However, Jinzi let the north wind blow and didn't react much. He played with a gold card in his hand. That gold card was returned to him by Mu Linger. He also wanted to forget that girl. However, he stayed in Northern Li and took over this mess for Ningcheng. It was all for that girl. Being in Northern Li, facing all these annoying things, how could he forget the instigator? He thought that he must have bullied that girl badly in his previous life. She must have tortured him like this in this life. If he continued to bully her miserably in this life, then would he still meet her in the next life? Thinking of this, Jinzi suddenly laughed. He called for the imperial bodyguard and handed the gold card to him. He instructed in a low voice, "Send someone to buy grain at a high price. Buy as much as you can, no matter how expensive it is." This gold card was under Mu Linger's name. After he used up the money she owed him, if there was an overdraft, she would naturally have to pay it back. Anyway, the bank would only look for her and not him. In this life, if love was too late, bullying her was also a happy thing. Jean Z seemed to have seen Mu Linger rushing in front of him and stomping her feet in anger. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl into a beautiful arc. He suddenly felt that this New Year's Eve was a little boring. A year ago, everyone knew that Northernly was short on grain. How many unscrupulous merchants were secretly hoarding grain and waiting to raise the price? How could Mu Linger, who was about to be drowned in debt, know that Jean Z, who hadn't interacted with her for several months, would trick her like this on New Year's Eve? When she returned to Medicine City, she took in many disciples and adopted a few orphans. She carefully selected the talented ones and personally taught them medical knowledge. Little Er and Chen Xiang were both learning from her. She also borrowed Lil Thing from Gu Beiyue. When spring came, she would conduct a large inspection in Medical City. She would examine all the fake and substandard products. When she borrowed Lil Thing from Gu Beiyue, she'd told her big sister about it, so she'd left her a message. The original words were, "If Lil Thing is willing to become a dog, you can take it with you." She didn't know how Gu Beiyue communicated with Lil Thing, but it actually agreed to come with her to Medicine City. It had to be said that Lil Thing's nose was much more sensitive than a dog's. It could tell the authenticity of Medicine City with a single sniff. Of course, one Lil Thing was far from enough, so she sent people to find 10 dogs to train. After spring came, she would be even busier. Not only did she have to establish a medicine control board, but she also had to cooperate with Gu Beiyue's operations in Medical City. She had never thought that she would one day return to Northernly after leaving home for a long time, after she was almost tricked into marrying him off. She had always been unhappy in the Mu family, but now that she was back, she was actually living a carefree life. It was late at night, and at this moment she was snoring away. Lil Thing was curled up by her feet. Suddenly 2 dog barks came from outside. Lil Thing immediately raised its head, revealing a vigilant expression. It waited for a while, but didn't hear anything else, so it ran out of the room. It went to stand outside a nearby kennel. When the group of dogs saw it, they immediately started barking. Lil Thing really didn't understand why Miss Ling brought back so many dogs. As a wolf, it looked down on dogs. Squeak. Lil Thing yelled at them to shut up. All the dogs immediately stopped, not understanding what Lil Thing wanted to do. After a while, seeing that Lil Thing didn't take any further action, they started barking again. In the eyes of these dogs, Lil Thing was just a mouse. Lil Thing was angry and glared at the dogs. The dogs sensed Lil Thing's provocation and barked even more fiercely. One of them even directly pounced on Lil Thing. Lil Thing was angry. It raised its head and roared at Sirius. In an instant, all the dogs stopped barking. The dog that pounced on Lil Thing fell to the ground motionless. It was scared to death. Lil Thing had unknowingly transformed into a big snow wolf. Its body was taller than a tiger, and its snow-white fur was very noble and elegant. Its pair of demonic red eyes were deep and cold. It looked down at the kennel from high above. The dogs were all crawling on the ground, trembling and not daring to make a sound. Lil Thing was very satisfied. It elegantly turned around and walked to Mu Linger's room. However, after a few steps, it couldn't take it anymore, and turned back into a little squirrel. It hadn't fully recovered yet, so the transformation time was very short. After turning back into a little squirrel, its previous elegance and nobility were all gone. It ran towards Mu Linger's room. From afar, it looked like a little snowball rolling. The huge commotion in the courtyard didn't wake Mu Linger up. Mu Linger was sleeping soundly. No one knew what she was dreaming of, but she was actually drooling. On New Year's Eve, everyone had their own excitement and their own dreams. Whether the nightmare was life-threatening, whether one wanted to wake up or not, the sky would always be bright. On the first day of the new year, Granny Zhao was the first to wake up in number 7 tea house. She personally prepared a sumptuous breakfast for her masters. Han Yunxi was woken up by Ruier. After Ruier woke up, he didn't remember what happened last night at all. He wrapped his arms around his mother's neck and acted like a spoiled child. Long Fei Yi was no longer in the room. When Han Yunxi woke up, she noticed that Ruier was still wearing the clothes from last night. She was about to get up. However, she suddenly remembered what happened last night and was so shocked that she immediately covered herself with the quilt. Ruier obviously noticed that his mother's expression wasn't right. He stared at her suspiciously and didn't move. Han Yunxi glanced under the quilt and saw that she was still wearing clothes. Her hanging heart finally relaxed. Last night, Long Fei Yi tormented her miserably. She didn't know how she fell asleep, let alone when Ruier came back. She lifted the quilt and saw that she was wearing a spaghetti strap and a nightgown. Her ears unconsciously heated up. God knows how Long Fei Yi helped her get dressed. Mother! Mother! Little Ruier called out to her in a childish voice, calling her both names. Han Yunxi was about to hug Ruier when she saw a big red packet lying behind him. Chapter 1235. Han Yunxi picked up the red packet that had fallen beside Ruier. It was none other than the one that Ruier had stolen. Seeing that his mother was about to take it, Ruier hurriedly grabbed a corner of the red packet and refused to let go. Han Yunxi would never have thought that the banknotes in the red packet were all hers. She was both amused and angry. She also grabbed a corner of the red packet and was in a deadlock with Ruier. Ruier, who gave this to you? She asked. Mother here. Ruier said seriously. Han Yunxi thought that Ruier was asking for a red packet from her. Last night, Ruier had given it to her in the Long Fei Yi, but she hadn't given it to him yet. Baby Ruier, wish Mother a happy new year. Mother will give you a big red packet. Han Yunxi smiled. In front of his mother, Ruier wasn't the arrogant crown prince. He was just a baby. He knelt on the bed and blinked his big innocent eyes, saying in a childish voice, Happy New Year. Good boy. Han Yunxi was happy. She turned to take the red packet that she had prepared. It was really a big one. Ruier's eyes lit up when he saw his mother bring another red packet. Han Yunxi couldn't help but laugh at her son's little money grubber. She lay on the bed and handed the red packet to Ruier. She asked seriously, Baby Ruier, Mother wants to ask you a few questions, okay? Okay. Ruier had already thrown away the big red packet and was focused on opening the one his mother gave him. Does father belong to Mother? Han Yunxi asked. Yes, Ruier answered without hesitation. Then does baby Ruier belong to Mother? Han Yunxi asked again. Even though Ruier was counting the banknotes in the red packet with his head down, he was able to multitask. He opened his mouth and shouted with all his might. Yes. Han Yunxi snickered and asked again. Then does father belong to Mother? She didn't know if Ruier could tell that the difference between the first and third question was the word belong. He still nodded. Yes. Han Yunxi smiled even more mischievously. Then is Ruier Bao's mother's? Yes. Ruier answered firmly. Han Yunxi immediately asked. All right, Ruier Bao's red packets are Imperial Mother's. Ruier Bao will give Imperial Mother all the red packets. Imperial Mother will take care of it. All right? All right, Ruier answered even more forcefully. But he soon looked up at his mother in confusion. Han Yunxi smiled innocently and reached out to take the red packet. Little Ruier hurriedly grabbed 2 red packets and hid under the bed. Not good. Han Yunxi couldn't stop laughing. Almost everyone thought that her son matured early. But in her eyes, baby Ruier was a silly baby. Mother won't take the red packet anymore. Can you tell Mother who gave it to you? Han Yunxi pointed at Ruier's left hand patiently. Although she didn't count it, she could see that there were a lot of banknotes inside. Long Fei Ye's red packet had already been given. Could it be Gu or Tang Li? According to etiquette, they couldn't give Ruier a red packet during the new year. However, there was no such thing as etiquette in number 7 tea house. Of course, they could give it to him. Here, Imperial Mother, Ruier answered honestly. Han Yunxi still didn't react, thinking that her son had mixed up the 2 red packets. She carried Ruier over and pointed at the red packet in his right hand. This was given to you by Imperial Mother. Who gave you the one in your left hand? Here, Imperial Mother, Ruer answered seriously. How did you become so stupid after a year? Han Yunxi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She opened the red packet and took a look. She found that there were 10 banknotes in it. It was really a big packet, just like the one her imperial father gave her. Could it be your godfather? Han Yunxi muttered to herself. Although Tang Li was also a generous person, he wasn't that generous. Han Yunxi called Granny Zhao to help Ruer freshen up and change his clothes. After dressing up, she took the big red packet and carried Ruer out. Long Fei Yi and the others were waiting for them at Tianxiang Pavilion to eat together. When Han Yunxi came over, everyone was discussing why Ruer was afraid of Long Fei Yi. Long Fei Yi didn't want to talk about it at first, but Gu asked him about it early in the morning. Tang Li and Ning Jing also knew about it. Tang Li kept talking in his ear, which was even more annoying than Gu. Han Yunxi came over. She was gratified and heartbroken to know that Ruer hugged Long Fei Yi last night. Sister-in-law, did you go to bed early last night? You didn't even know that Ruer was in such a mess? Tang Li asked. Yes, Han Yunxi replied in a low voice. She glanced at Long Fei Yi. Unfortunately, Long Fei Yi was also looking at her with a teasing smile. Han Yunxi quietly stepped on him, but Long Fei Yi was calm as if nothing had happened. Ruer knew that everyone was talking about him, but he didn't quite understand what they were talking about. At this moment, he was competing with Little Tang Tang with his eyes. Little Tang Tang was staring at his big red packet, and he returned a look of disdain. Little Tang Tang continued to stare, and he returned a warning look. Little Tang Tang was still staring, so he narrowed his eyes and stared back. The two children were flirting with each other, and didn't pay attention to what the adults were saying. Gu was silent for a while, then suddenly slammed the table seriously. Long Fei Yi, do your work. Leave this to me. I'll take Ruer to Sky Mountain. If that doesn't work, I'll take him to the mysterious continent to find Han Chen. Long Fei Yi didn't answer. He just stared at Gu's serious expression. Gu said that he would maintain a serious attitude at first, but after being stared at by Long Fei Yi for a long time, he felt more and more guilty. In the end, he turned his head away to avoid Long Fei Yi's gaze. He pursed his lips so that he wouldn't give himself away, and said seriously, no matter what, we have to get to the bottom of this as soon as possible. Okay, take him away in a few days. Long Fei Yi actually agreed. Gu Qishao gave a start before breaking into a smile. He turned back and asked, really? Long Fei Yi replied expressionlessly, not really. Han Yunxi and the Tongning couple were a little nervous at first, but when Long Fei Yi said this, the three of them all burst into laughter. Gu's face darkened. Cold, he said. Long Fei Yi, you're busy with work. Where will you find the time to take Ruer to Sky Mountain? It's not the end of spring yet, so I can't go up. Han Chen will arrive in Cloud Realm before the Qingming festival. He's prepared the best spring tea in Cloud Realm for him. I don't need to look for him. He'll come to me himself. Long Fei Yi replied. Only then did everyone know that Long Fei Yi and Han Chen had written letters. Han Yunxi, his biological daughter, didn't like Han Chen. Why did Long Fei Yi hit it off with Han Chen? It wasn't that Long Fei Yi wasn't worried, but that everything about little Ruer was normal. Gu Beiwei had checked on him a few times, and said there wouldn't be any problems. Gu was resentful and speechless. Han Yunxi was planning to take Ruer to Sky Mountain herself, but now that Han Chen had come to Cloud Realm continent, she didn't need to make another trip. Han Chen should know more about the Lustbite energy than old Kenzo. After all, his strength far surpassed the Lustbite energy. With little Ruer around, Han Yunxi and Long Fei Yi didn't like to talk about it. Little Ruer more or less knew what they were talking about. Long Fei Yi quickly changed the topic to help his son get a red packet. Tangli, where's your red packet? There were many rules in the palace, so few people were allowed to give red packets to Ruer. Here at number 7 tea house, everything was done according to seniority. Tangli couldn't skimp on his red packet. Tangli was long prepared. He carried little Tang Tang, and sat in front of Ruer with a smile. Ruer, do you want a red packet? Happy New Year. Ruer's earnest tone made everyone laugh. Tangli happily handed over the red packet. Gu had already given little Tang Tang a red packet. He scooted over to Ruer's side and crouched down to stuff something into his pocket. Wanted to take it out, but Gu quickly stopped him. Hide it well, he said in a low voice. Look at it tonight. Otherwise it'll be stolen. Immediately looked at little Tang Tang warily, and didn't dare to move. Gu gave the same thing he gave him last year. While was happy to receive the red packet, Han Yunxi was stunned. That's weird. She picked up the big red packet in Rue's hand and asked, who gave this? Little Tang Tang's gaze finally moved away from and followed the big red packet. The adults didn't notice it, but when Rue came over, she noticed that the red packet was very big. It was bigger than all the red packets she had received before combined. She had been very sensitive to banknotes since she was young. Only then did everyone notice the big red packet. Long Fei asked curiously, what's going on? I found it on the couch today. It should have fallen from him. 10 banknotes worth 1,000 taels. Who gave it? Han Yunxi was a little uneasy. Other than Long Fei, who was a big spender, everyone gave out red packets for the new year just for luck. Who would spend so much money? There was no one else in number 7 tea house. Suddenly, Han Yunxi was stunned. She thought of something. She had given 10 red packets with such a large amount of red packets before. Those 10 red packets were for the 4 duchesses, the 3 generals' wives, and the 3 first-rank titled madams. None of those women were easy to deal with. Han Yunxi quickly took out all the banknotes from the red packet and looked at the bank that had given them. They were all from Kangon Bank. Now half of Han Yunxi's world turned black. The banknotes she had prepared for the red packets were all from Kangon Bank. These 10 banknotes were the ones she had put into the red packet yesterday. There was no mistaking it. Little Rue was completely unaware of the trouble he had caused. He was still looking at little Tang Tang, guarding against her snatching his big red packet. Han Yunxi looked at Long Fei and muttered, trouble. After midnight last night, she had ordered the maidservants to send out all the red packets. They would arrive in Yuning by tonight, right? No matter what, it would be too late to stop them. She had given those madams big red packets because she couldn't be bothered to fight with those senseless old women. She wanted to bet on their mouths and let them have a peaceful new year. Now, she couldn't even imagine the expressions of those old man's people when they received the empty red packet shells. Long Fei knew that Han Yunxi had prepared 10 big red packets. He took a banknote and looked at it. He knew what was going on. Han Yunxi was dumbfounded. Long Fei couldn't help but laugh. Chapter 1236. Rue actually stole money. After Han Yunxi explained the situation, not only did Long Fei laugh, but Gu and Tang Li also couldn't help but laugh. It was the first day of the new year, and Rue was caught stealing money. Tang Li coughed lightly and said seriously, brother, you can't spoil him for stealing money. You must teach him a lesson. Long Fei, Han Yunxi, and Gu all glared at him, including Ning Jing. Did a child who wasn't even a year old know what money was? Little Tang Tang understood, and casually stared at the red packet. Rue didn't understand. It was his first time receiving a red packet this year, and it was even his first time seeing banknotes. Previously in Yuning Palace, he had only seen Han Yunxi and Long Fei reward the servants with broken pieces of silver. Long Fei was about to speak, but Gu was the first to flare up. He stared coldly at Tang Li. Say that again. Tang Li was a fellow with a short memory. As soon as he had a daughter, he started showing off. He'd already annoyed Long Fei once. If this kept up, heaven knows if Long Fei would kick him back to the Tang clan. I was just joking. You guys don't be so serious. Tang Li's mouth twitched. He was afraid of these people. It's not to the extent of stealing money, but it's certain that he stole something. Long Fei said objectively. Tang Li was convinced by this, and so was Ning Jing. Although Han Yunxi didn't want to admit that her precious son had stolen things, she still nodded. If it was a daughter, she could spoil her a little, but when it came to her son, she should be ruthless. However, Gu was indignant on behalf of Rue. How could a child who wasn't even a year old distinguish so clearly? Rue didn't take things from outsiders. He might not even care if they were given to him. He had only taken his mother's things. Did he know what these things were for? Would he be able to tell whether it was his mother's or his? Gu took Rui from his arms and let him sit on his lap. He was so angry that he didn't want to speak. It was fine if Tang Li made a joke, but Long Fei's attitude, was it necessary? Rui was confused. He knew the word steal, but he didn't understand it very well. In the past, if there was something I didn't understand, I would look to Grand Tutor. Now that Grand Tutor wasn't here, he looked to Imperial Father and Imperial Mother. Long Fei got up and walked over. He squatted in front of his son and asked seriously, Rui, do you know what steal is? Rui nodded. Long Fei asked again. Then do you know what fight is? Rui shook his head. Rui, don't take things that don't belong to you no matter how much you like them. Got it? Long Fei said seriously. Perhaps Rui would understand better if he used the word take. Sure enough, Rui nodded. Long Fei smiled and said, but you can fight. If you win, it's yours. Hearing this, Gu Qishao, who was about to refute Long Fei, shut up. He agreed with Long Fei's last sentence. If you like something, fight for it. Fighting was a great skill. Who do you fight with? How do you fight? Can you fight? On what basis? What is the bottom line of the fight? What comes after fighting is abandoning and cherishing. Rui didn't understand these things even now. However, Long Fei knew that he would have to teach him in the future. Perhaps he would teach more. Perhaps Han Yunqi would teach more. Perhaps Gu Beiwa would teach more. He was good at fighting in the dark. Han Yunqi was good at fighting in the open, and Gu Beiyue's realm might be higher. He won without fighting. It was easy to fight for the world, but difficult to defend. How much fighting was hidden in the word defend? Rui was the crown prince, the first person to defend the country. Rui still had a lot to learn. His path had just begun. Long Fei didn't know that Rui had taken the money. He was just using this to teach Rui a word, fight. Perhaps Rui didn't understand, but at least he knew and remembered this word. Rui repeated after Long Fei. Yes, fight. Long Fei immediately ordered for a brush, ink, paper and inkstone, and wrote a large fight word on the spot. Rui had already learned to read. Seeing the unfamiliar word, he came over and asked, Imperial Father, fight? Long Fei only nodded and didn't say anything else. Rui lay at the side, looking at the word seriously and memorizing it. It was all thanks to Gu Beiyue that he could learn to read at such a young age and develop such good habits. Perhaps the most precious thing Long Fei had given his son wasn't Cloud Realm, but Gu Beiyue. Although little Tang Tang could understand and speak many words, she hadn't even started learning to read yet. She hadn't received much education and had been raised by her grandmother and Auntie Ling for the first year of her life. All she did was play. After she turned a year old, she followed her mother for a few months, running to the mountains to plant flowers, or staying by her parents' side to watch her father fiddle with hidden weapons and her mother work on the abacus. She looked at the big word written by her imperial uncle and began to read it in a low voice. Fight! Ningjing hadn't found it strange when she saw Rui's early maturity. After all, Long Fei and Han Yunqi were his parents, so it was normal for him to grow up early. But now that Rui had learned to read before he was even a year old, Ningjing was truly surprised to see Long Fei teach him like this. 3 years old looked like an adult. The teachings before 3 years old had a subtle influence, and it was the influence that was most easily overlooked. Tang Li spoiled his daughter to the heavens, protecting and doting on her. Ningjing was a mother for the first time, and had never seriously considered Tang Tang's upbringing. She couldn't count on Tang Li anymore. No matter if I'm in the Tang clan or wandering the outside world, no matter how bad my relationship with Tang Li becomes, my daughter's education will always come first. On the first day of the new year, under Tang Li's suggestion, everyone disguised themselves and brought their children to a nearby town to join in the fun. The 2 children had never seen such a lively scene before, and were extremely excited. Since they were happy, the adults were naturally happy too. As for the empty red packets, Long Fei said to Han Yunqi, let it be. Let's see how those old man people react before we discuss it. Han Yunqi knew that she would have to face annoying things after returning to the palace. However, she still had a lot of fun these few days. On the fourth day of the new year, Long Fei Yi was ready to set off for Yuning Palace. At the beginning of the country's founding, there was a pile of government affairs entangled with him. In addition, the disaster in Northern Li hadn't been alleviated yet, so he couldn't leave for too long. "Brother, Ning Jing and I will stay for a few more days before looking for you," Tang Li said with a smile. Gu was on their roof. When he heard this, he rolled his eyes and didn't say anything. This tea house was his. What was the use of Tang Li asking about Long Fei Yi? Long Fei Yi personally tidied up a few urgent letters as he answered. "You can ask Rui. This tea house belongs to him." Gu liked hearing this. He was happy and hung down from the eaves to look into the house. He saw Tang Li carrying little Tang Tang and running to Rui. He asked nicely, "Nephew, can Uncle Li and Aunt Jing stay here?" Rui was folding paper. He ignored Tang Li and glanced at little Tang Tang before continuing with his work. "Baby Rui, you guys go home first. Uncle Li will stay here, okay?" Tang Li asked again. Rui turned around and still ignored Tang Li. He asked little Tang Tang seriously, "Tang Tang, are you a mouse?" "Tang Tang? Mouse." Han Yunxi and Ning Jing looked over puzzled. "You're the mouse." Little Tang Tang was angry. Rui didn't argue with her. He wanted to yield to this little sister. He didn't understand why this little sister was so clingy. She was so clingy with the little thing. And the little thing also stayed in the Grand Tutor's arms every day. He hadn't seen her come down from her father's arms these past few days. Little Tang Tang didn't know what Rui was thinking. She was innocent. Her father liked to hug her and held her in his arms all day. She couldn't do anything about it. Rui couldn't be bothered with her anymore. When Tang Li asked a few more questions, Rui simply covered his ears. Looking at Tang Li's defeated expression, even Ning Jing wanted to laugh at him. Tang Li suddenly hoped that Long Fei Yi would have a daughter soon. He wanted to see how Rui would treat his biological sister. At this time, Long Fei Yi looked back and said seriously, "Tang Li, go to Yuning as soon as you arrive. Rui will be 1 year old in a while. It's up to you whether to invite your father or not." The Tang clan held two positions. One was in charge of the military equipment, and the other was in charge of the construction of the imperial capital and palace. Both of these were important matters. The construction of the imperial capital and palace would come to an end. As for the military equipment, as long as the country existed, so would the equipment. He didn't want the Tang clan to fall into chaos. He also didn't want Tang Zijin to be impeached by the imperial court because he was busy with the construction of the imperial capital. There were many people who coveted the benefits of the military equipment, and Bailey Yuanlong was one of them. Long Fei Yi was the first to know that Bailey Yuanlong had colluded with the Southern Army. Although he hadn't exposed it or done anything to this day, he knew everything in his heart. Bailey Yuanlong would probably never know how stifled and uncomfortable his heart felt. Bailey Yuanlong was different from the others, and the Bailey army was different from the other military factions. The Bailey clan was once his most trusted clan, as well as the one he relied on the most. Bailey Yuanlong had endured patiently with him for more than 10 years, accompanying him from Tianning civil strife to Cloud Realm Continent's chaos, to the recent establishment of the Great Qin Empire. But now, he was the person he had to be most wary of. The history books all said that when the birds were gone, the bow would be put away. When the cunning rabbit was dead, the hounds would be cooked. Those whose achievements overshadowed their masters would die. But how many times did the emperor have no choice but to be forced into a corner? Those whose achievements overshadowed their master's ambitions. If Bailey Yuanlong had colluded with other military factions, he could turn a blind eye to it. But those people from the Jiangnan military faction couldn't obtain the position of empress or gain any benefits. Instead, they were forced to provide grain for disaster relief. They had long harbored thoughts of rebellion. Tang Li still hadn't figured out the meaning behind Long Fei Ye's words. But Long Fei Ye's serious tone was enough to put Tang Li on guard. He stopped joking around and nodded seriously. "All right. I'll go with you." Long Fei Yi glanced at Gu, who was hanging upside down by the door. Gu suddenly felt a little nervous, thinking that Long Fei Yi was going to take him back to Yuning Palace as well. But Long Fei Yi said, "Don't block the way, get out of the way." Gu's face darkened. and he was so angry that he almost fell over. He flew to the roof and sat down, thinking to himself that it was fine if Long Feiyi didn't invite him to Yuning Palace. He just so happened to have time to go to Jiangnan to find some good tea. Han Chen liked preaching Ming tea, didn't he? He'd definitely find something better than Long Feiyi. Gu left number 7 tea house first, followed by Long Feiyi's group. The spring festival had ended early. When they returned to Yuning Palace, there were several big troubles waiting for Long Feiyi and Han Yunxi. Chapter 1237. By the time Han Yunxi's group returned to Yuning Palace, it was already the 6th day of the new year. They arrived at night, but Long Feiyi didn't even have time to rest before heading to the imperial study. There were plenty of memorials to the emperor waiting for him to deal with. Han Yunxi and Rui had no idea when Long Feiyi returned to his quarters. In any case, when mother and son woke up the next day, Long Feiyi wasn't there. Han Yunxi had long gotten used to his busy schedule, so this wasn't even his busiest time. Even when they were in the same palace, she and Rui wouldn't see him for 2 to 3 days. Han Yunxi walked out the door and looked at the palace. She couldn't help but think of the time when she lived at the Duke of Qin's estate. Long Feiyi had been busy back then as well, so she often went days without seeing him. Now that she'd finally seen him, he'd come looking for trouble with a cold face. Yuning Prefecture was the temporary capital city and the liveliest place in Cloud Realm continent. The inner city was filled with nobles, civil and military officials, while the outer city was filled with commoners. The madams and young misses of the inner city organized all sorts of banquets to recite poems, compose poems, admire flowers, and write lyrics. Almost every banquet had amusing or scandalous news to spread and become the butt of jokes. If there were only 2 kinds of people who were invited to every banquet, one would be the most popular, and the other would be the least popular. Han Yunxi had been the least popular back in Tianning's capital city. Everyone wanted to see her make a fool of herself. Now she was the woman no one dared to invite. Since no one dared to invite her, she was happy to stay in the palace and play with her baby Rui. That was one of life's greatest joys. On Tang Li's first day in Yuning, he took Ning Jing and little Tang Tang to a temple fair in the outer city. Han Yunxi didn't go with them. She was waiting for the 10 old man's men to make trouble. She hadn't even returned to the palace when she confirmed that the 10 empty red envelopes had all been delivered to the old man's men. She even specifically asked a maidservant and a eunuch who handled this matter. The maidservant sent the red packets to Yuning Palace by Eagle. The eunuch took over and arranged for them to be distributed. When the servant girl counted the red packets, she noticed that there were 10 red packets without banknotes. When the eunuch went to each manor to distribute the red packets, he also noticed the 10 empty red packets. However, the 2 of them didn't dare to say anything. They all thought that the empress did it on purpose. How could Han Yunxi blame them? Han Yunxi originally thought that as soon as she returned to the palace, the old man's people would come to her door. However, as the days passed, there was still no movement from this matter. If it was other people who received an empty red packet, they would be terrified and would not dare to say anything. They would only nervously try to figure out the empress' intentions and reflect on how they had offended the empress. However, the 10 madams were different. It would be strange if they didn't seize this opportunity to teach Han Yunxi a lesson. However, Han Yunxi waited for 2 days, but there was no movement from the group of madams. Han Yunxi was puzzled and became more cautious. She also didn't take the initiative to mention this matter. She quietly waited and observed the changes. The 9th day of the new year was coming. The 9th day of the new year was Xianyuan Rui's first birthday. It was the first birthday of his life. Long Feiyi originally planned to hold a banquet for his first birthday. The invitations were also sent out. However, who knew that a few days after he returned to the palace, bad news came from Northern Li. Northern Li and avalanche. Originally, the disaster had not been alleviated. After the beginning of spring, as the weather warmed up, there were several small-scale avalanches. Many herdsmen were killed or injured. It was unknown what man-made rumors said that the emperor wanted to give up Northern Li. The entire Northern Li could be said to be shrouded in a pessimistic atmosphere. On the night of the 8th day of the new year, Tang Li and Ning Jing rushed back from the outer city. Tang Li directly rushed to Long Fei Ye's imperial study. He leaned on the table and asked, "Brother, tomorrow is Rueyer's first birthday banquet. What do you plan to do?" Northern Li had an avalanche. The country was in trouble, and the people were in trouble. If they held a big banquet for celebration, how many people would talk about it? Not to mention Long Fei Yi and Han Yunxi. Even little Ruey, or who didn't know anything, would be condemned. Long Fei Yi raised his head from a pile of memorials and asked seriously, "You invited your father?" "Brother, I'm asking you something serious. The common people outside the city are talking about how the herdsmen in Northern Li can't eat. But you want to hold a banquet for the crown prince. Brother, those people are looking for an opportunity to criticize the crown prince. Don't harm Rueyer." Tang Li said seriously. Tang Li knew about the open and secret struggle between Bailey Yuanlong and his father. However, he didn't know much about the current situation and didn't understand it well enough. He originally didn't pay attention to this matter and even prepared a very special gift for Ruey. However, when he went to the temple fair in the outer city, he heard all kinds of rumors and slanders. He was so angry that he directly rushed back and didn't care about anything else. Ning Jing chased after him with little Tang Tang. Seeing Tang Li so impudent, she was about to speak when Han Yunxi stopped her. To have a younger brother like Tang Li who dared to rush here and slam the table with Long Fei Yi was also a kind of fortune for Long Fei Yi. When fighting for the country, everyone was loyal. When it came to defending the country, those who fought for fame and fortune were also fighting for it with all their hearts. That was then and this is now. Otherwise, the words protecting the country wouldn't be so difficult to write. As the head of the Tang sect, Tang Li was also in the circle of interests. However, Han Yunxi knew that Tang Li would never change. "Do you have any good ideas?" Long Fei Yi asked seriously. Tang Li thought for a long time before replying. "Cancel the birthday banquet and celebrate it with Rueyer in private." The reason why there were so many rumors outside was because tomorrow was the 9th day of the new year, and Long Fei Yi still hadn't released the news of canceling the banquet. Ning Jing couldn't help but step forward and bow. "Your Majesty, this subject's husband thinks of canceling the banquet and donating all the expenses in the name of the crown prince to the victims of the Northern Li disaster. This way, all the ministers will have to follow suit. Canceling the banquet at this time would appear insincere and would show that the emperor and empress were afraid of those who spread rumors. However, in the current situation, the banquet had to be cancelled. Thus, Ning Jing thought of this idea as a way to make up for it. Long Fei Yi raised his eyebrows and looked at Tang Li. "In my opinion, I can rest assured that your wife will be in charge of the Tang sect in the future." In front of Tang Li and the others, Long Fei Yi had never put on airs and didn't refer to himself as Your Majesty. Tang Li was proud that Ning Jing could come up with this idea. As long as Ning Jing was willing, he could also hand over the affairs of the Tang sect to Ning Jing without any reservations. It was a pity that he didn't have the final say in the Tang sect. His father still controlled the Tang sect's elders. Tang Li sat to the side and muttered, "She and I are both running away. Why should we care about the Tang sect?" Long Fei Yi casually threw down 2 booklets. Tang Li caught them and looked at them. His face immediately lit up. One of the booklets was from the Ministry of War, and the other was from the Ministry of Works. The Ministry of War complained that the Tang sect hadn't received the first batch of weapons they were supposed to deliver at the beginning of spring. The Ministry of Works complained that Tang Zijin hadn't returned to the imperial capital since he returned to the Tang sect in the 12th lunar month. Because of Tang Zijin's absence, the construction of the imperial capital had been delayed for several days. The Ministry of Works and the Ministry of War both pointed their spears at the Tang sect. However, they didn't take into account how many more booklets would come after these 2 booklets, and how many people would covet the Tang sect. These 2 reports were enough for Long Fei to force Tang Zijin's hand. Tang Zijin was definitely still busy with the weapons at the Tang sect. Ning Jing had always been in charge of those weapons. Because they were second-hand modifications, There were many things that Tang Zijin didn't know about. It was very difficult for him to take over. As for the imperial capital, Tang Zijin had to personally oversee the construction of the imperial city. Without Tang Zijin, there was no progress in the construction of the imperial palace. It was difficult for Tang Zijin to do two things at the same time. He couldn't split himself up. Tang Li carefully read the two booklets and said, "Big brother, it's time to test my father." If Tang Zijin knew that Tang Li had said such a thing, he would probably be so angry that he wouldn't recognize him as his son. However, this was the truth. It was time to test Tang Zijin. Now there were only two paths in front of Tang Zijin. The first was to compromise with Tang Li and Ning Jing. He would bring the couple back and have Ning Jing continue to be in charge of the weapons while he returned to the imperial capital as soon as possible. The second was to find someone else to take over the Tang sect's weapons. Tang Zijin naturally knew that many people in the imperial court were eyeing the lucrative job of weapons. The Tang sect had made many enemies because of this. If he was willing to give up the profits and find someone else to take over the weapons, the Tang sect would definitely attract many collaborators and allies. They might even become a major faction. In fact, if Tang Zijin extended an olive branch to the southern military, many of them would very likely cast Bailey Yuanlong aside and cooperate with the Tang sect. What choice would Tang Zijin make then? On one hand, he would accept Ning Jing and leave the Tang sect without descendants. On the other hand, he would accept foreign aid and form a faction. It had to be said that this was an extremely difficult choice for Tang Zijin. However, it was precisely such a difficult choice that could test Tang Zijin's sincerity. Ning Jing's expression turned serious. Tang Li, this heartless thing, was actually still smiling. Han Yunxi said, "Tang Li, whether you and Ning Jing return or not is the Tang sect's business. The weapons are an important matter for the imperial court. Now, it can be said that your family's business and the imperial court's business are mixed together. It's up to you to decide how to use these two booklets. I'll do what needs to be done." Tang Li didn't hesitate. He withdrew his smile and said seriously, "Sister-in-law, I also want to know if my father will become a second Bailey Yuanlong." Long Fei had been waiting for these exact words. He didn't deal with this matter publicly. Instead, he ordered someone to send the two memorials directly to the Tang sect for Tang Zijin to see. Tang Zijin was a smart man. He knew what to do as soon as he saw the memorials. Han Yunxi asked jokingly, "Tang Li, Ning Jing, if the birthday banquet is cancelled, will you still give Ru'er a gift?" "Of course. I've already prepared it. Tomorrow we'll celebrate Ru'er's birthday ourselves." Tang Li smiled at Ru'er, who was flipping through a book. "Crown Prince, you'll definitely like tomorrow's gift." Ru'er glanced back and didn't react much before burying his head back into his book. He didn't understand, but he liked reading those words. Tomorrow's birthday banquet won't be cancelled. The banquet will go on as usual, and the gift will still be received. Han Yunxi said with a smile, "This is my son's first birthday. I want to make it a big deal. Let's see what those people can do to us." Tang Li and Ning Jing were shocked. Her Majesty the Empress was so willful? Was it really all right? Chapter 1238. Han Yunxi's willfulness stunned Tang Li. He blurted out, "Sister-in-law, are you stupid? Did you really say that?" The most discussed rumor in the outer city was what Han Yunxi had just said. She said that all the ministers were advising against canceling the birthday banquet. But the Empress said that the Crown Prince's first birthday must be celebrated in a big way. Han Yunxi rolled her eyes at Tang Li. "You're the stupid one. Empress, you want to force them to donate to disaster relief at the birthday banquet?" Ning Jing asked. She knew that Han Yunxi wasn't that stupid. Not only that, Han Yunxi sneered. She had Ning Jing and Tang Li come closer and whispered to them. Long Fei already knew about Han Yunxi's plan tomorrow. He watched from the side and couldn't help but laugh. The infighting in the imperial court was really boring. Occasionally, Han Yunxi the Empress would stir up this big pool. It was a kind of pleasure. Tomorrow's birthday banquet should be very interesting. That night, before Long Fei went to bed, He personally flew over the eaves and vaulted over the walls to check all the roofs in the palace. However, he didn't see Gu's figure. Although he didn't let Gu come back with them, he still sent someone to give him the invitation to Rueyer's birthday banquet. Wasn't this guy coming? Although Gu said that number 7 tea house was to be given to Rueyer, he hadn't officially given it away yet. At the very least, he had to bring the deed over. Han Yunxi could stir up trouble, but Gu was even more so. If he didn't show up, tomorrow's birthday banquet would really lose a lot of fun. That night the palace was peaceful. However, the inner and outer cities of Yuning, and even the entire Great Qin Empire, were all paying attention to the palace. They were all waiting to see if the palace would send out a message to cancel tomorrow's birthday banquet. Bailey Yuanlong was the most concerned about this matter. In the dead of night, Bailey Yuanlong was having a secret meeting with Xiao Dong, the commander of the Southern Army. Xiao Dong had just turned 40 this year, and was a full 16 years younger than Bailey Yuanlong. However, he was older than Northern Commander Jin Zi, Western Commander Chu Tianyin, and Eastern Commander Luo Tuesday. Xiao Dongwen couldn't plan, and he couldn't even defend himself in martial arts. In the Southern Army, where there were so many talented people, he was actually a useless person. However, Xiao Dong had a powerful background. Xiao Dong was a member of the Xiao clan, the head of the southern clans. When Long Fei Yi was still at the top of Tianshan Mountain, Patriarch Xiao was invited to the Medical City Conference and openly opposed Gu Beiwei, who supported Han Yunxi. The Xiao family had set their sights on the position of the Empress a few years ago. It would be strange if they didn't oppose Han Yunxi. Long Fei Yi had wanted to settle this debt long ago. If not for Gu Beiwei stopping him, Long Fei Yi would have found an excuse to wipe out the Xiao clan after he became the emperor. It had to be said that the Xiao clan's influence in the south was enormous and complex. A slight move in one part could affect the whole situation. Once Long Fei Yi took control of the Xiao clan, the south would fall into chaos. Currently, the western, northern, eastern, and central regions were in a state of post-war reconstruction. Whether it was in terms of finances or food, most of the people had to come from the south. The south couldn't fall into chaos. The Southern Army had seized this opportunity to act so impudently. Of course, the Southern Army's supporters, the major clans behind the scenes, were all very smart. They knew that Long Fei Yi was slowly making plans for the south, so they had to take advantage of this opportunity to gain more power and allies for themselves. Xiao Dong was only a spokesperson chosen by the major clans of the south. He was very different from Bailey Yuanlong. However, the two of them had many common understandings. First, they both felt that Long Fei Yi had been too hasty in appointing Jin Zi, Chu Tianyin, and Luo Tu as commanders. Jin Zi and Chu Tianyin weren't even 30 yet, while Luo Tu was the nephew of Kangon Private Bank's shopkeeper Luo. He had just turned 30 last year. According to Xiao Dong and Bailey Yuanlong, these three brats weren't even fully grown yet. What could they accomplish? Second, their spearhead was Han Yunxi. The Southern Army's ultimate goal was the position of Empress. The son of the Empress was the heir apparent. Thus, to put it more bluntly, they hoped that the Crown Prince, or even the future heir apparent, would be on their side and seek greater benefits for their clans. Bailey Yuanlong wanted nothing more than for the Southern Army to grow stronger and seize the position of Empress. In his opinion, as long as the Southern Army grew stronger, the Emperor would need him even more. He would have no choice but to rope him in. After all, from the looks of it, only the Bailey clan could contend with the Southern military faction. Bailey Yuanlong and Xiao Dong sat across from each other on the tea couch. They had been chatting for a long time, waiting for news from the palace. Although it was a private meeting, they were still courteous to each other. After all, they didn't treat each other with sincerity. They were both fighting for benefits, so they were both on guard against each other. After a long silence, Xiao Dong probed. Sir Bailey, it's already so late. In my opinion, there shouldn't be any news from the palace, right? What was he probing for? He wanted to know if Bailey Yuanlong had any informants in the palace with Long Fei Yi or Han Yunxi. All the civil and military officials of the imperial court wanted to bribe the people in the palace to find out some information. Unfortunately, it was very difficult because Long Fei Yi didn't have a harem. Only he and Han Yunxi lived in Yuning Palace, so they didn't need many servants. Xiaodong pondered. Bailey Yuanlong was the former second-in-command of the East Qin camp, so he must be familiar with Long Fei Ye's trusted aides. Even if he couldn't bribe the people around the two masters, he should at least have some informants in the palace, right? As for whether Bailey Yuanlong had any informants in the palace, only he knew. Bailey Yuanlong replied, "Let's wait a bit longer. If there really isn't any news, then that's fine." Thus the two fell into silence again. But after a while, Xiaodong couldn't hold it in anymore. "Sir Bailey, if the Empress insists, then the two of us will have to advance and retreat together tomorrow." They had already agreed that if the birthday banquet wasn't cancelled tomorrow, they wouldn't mention it in the morning court. Instead, they would remonstrate and denounce the Empress in front of all the congratulatory guests. After all, it was the Empress who had said that it had to be a grand affair. Of course, Bailey Yuanlong nodded calmly. The two of them would definitely wait a bit longer. Unfortunately, it was almost dawn, but there was still no news of the banquet being cancelled. Since it was time to go to court, Xiaodong couldn't stay any longer and got up to leave. After sending Xiaodong off, Bailey Yuanlong sat down and drank a few mouthfuls of strong tea to sober himself up. At this time, a woman close to 30 walked out from behind a curtain. Although she was a bit old, she was born with a dignified beauty that could captivate even birds and beasts. She had the air of a lady from a noble family, enough to make people forget her age. This woman was none other than Bailey Mingxiang's eldest daughter, noble consort Xiao, who had been undercover in northern Li for many years. She'd risen from a small palace, made to become the favored consort of the northern dynasty's emperors, and Bailey Mingxiang's older sister. She'd hidden herself very deeply in northern Li for a very long time. Even when northern Li fell into civil strife, she didn't leave the northern dynasty's emperors. She'd followed them all the way to the north, until she learned that the northern dynasty's emperors had committed suicide. She'd stolen many of the northern Li imperial family's treasures, and knew the situation in northern Li like the back of her hand. She even had many trusted aides in northern Li. Bailey Yuanlong was a martial artist. When he'd followed Long Fei Yi in the past, he'd been as stubborn as a rock. But now, he'd managed to hook up with the southern generals precisely because of his daughter's help behind the scenes. Bailey Lixiang had toiled in northern Li's palace for so many years. How could her shrewdness and methods be simple? The Bailey clan had sacrificed so much for the East Qin imperial family. In her eyes, Long Fei Yi should have at least made her father a prince, and let her younger brother inherit the title in the future. That way, the Bailey clan would always enjoy the treatment of a prince. But not only did Long Fei Yi refuse, he even listened to Han Yunxi's words, and divided the military power into 5. He even gave Han Yunxi the highest military power. The Bailey clan had followed Long Fei Yi the longest and sacrificed the most. Why shouldn't they enjoy special privileges? She and her father still couldn't accept that Long Fei Yi would give the Western military power to the Nether clan's Chu Tianyin and the Black clan's Jin Zi. In their eyes, this was a very risky and foolish move. It was digging one's own grave. "Father, you should go rest. As I see it, this matter isn't so simple. It's best to be careful tomorrow." Bailey Lixiang was shrewd and cunning, but she was also a filial daughter. She didn't seek benefits for herself, but even if she had to die, she'd do it for her father and her brothers. The notion that a woman should sacrifice herself for her family was branded in her heart, and would never be erased. How could Bailey Yuanlong be in the mood to rest? In front of Xiaodong, he was calm and collected, but in front of his daughter, his anxiety was completely exposed. "Lixiang, how can father sleep? Tomorrow, Xiaodong and I will join forces to persuade her." "What if?" "Father, there's no what if. As long as Han Yunxi dares to make a big deal of it, she won't be able to turn things around this time. I've not only convinced a few ministers, but also many commoners. Everything should be ready by now. As soon as the banquet starts, those commoners will definitely block the 4 city gates. Also, father, Han Yunxi was in the wrong in the first place. I don't believe the Northern Li military will lock her up." Bailey Lixiang said seriously. Bailey Yuanlong nodded. His daughter's comforting words made him feel much more at ease. Father, do you remember when Han Yunxi used Tianning's Empress Dowager's birthday banquet to raise donations? Bailey Lixiang asked. Hearing this, Bailey Yuanlong grew nervous again. Could it be that this time she... Father, don't worry. Daughter has already made preparations. Even if she raises donations, daughter can still deal with her. Bailey Lixiang's lips curved into a cold smile. In the candlelight, she truly looked like a viper. What method? Bailey Yuanlong asked hastily. Bailey Lixiang whispered something in his ear, causing Bailey Yuanlong to look surprised. Is there really such a thing? I've personally paid a visit to all 10 madams. It can't be faked. Bailey Lixiang replied in a low voice. Only then did Bailey Yuanlong relax. He had been very nervous before, but now he was looking forward to it. He couldn't wait for the birthday banquet to start as soon as possible. You should rest early too. It's your first meeting with the Emperor tomorrow, so you have to rest well, Bailey Yuanlong said seriously. I still have to go pick up my little sister later. She should be arriving in Yuning soon. Bailey Lixiang couldn't help but complain. That girl Mingxiang really doesn't know any better. Instead of thinking of a way to stay in Yuning, she ran off to become an army doctor. Chapter 1239. No one mentioned the Crown Prince's birthday banquet during the morning court session on the 9th. Some didn't dare to bring it up, while Bailey Yuanlong purposely didn't mention it. The focus of the morning court session was still on the northerly snowstorm, as well as the revision of the tax uniform. The impact of the tax system was widespread and involved the interests of all parties. Long Fei wasn't in a rush to change the rules, but simply tossed a rock onto the surface of the lake to test its depth. After the morning court session, Long Fei Yi returned to the imperial study as usual. The so-called morning court session was just the ministers bringing up the matters they wanted to report, the emperor bringing up the matters he wanted to do, and everyone discussed it. The real place to make decisions wasn't the Crepe Myrtle Hall, but the imperial study. As soon as Long Fei Yi arrived at the imperial study, a group of ministers followed him and asked for an audience. When Long Fei Yi returned to the imperial study, Han Yunxi and Rui had just woken up. Rui and Tang Tang got along very well on the way back from the number 7 tea house. Although Rui didn't pay much attention to others, the two could still stay in the same place and play on their own. After handing the children over to the servants, Han Yunxi and Ning Jing began their inspection. In order to prepare for the birthday banquet, Han Yunxi had been secretly busy for a few days. Last night, she and Ning Jing worked until very late before going to bed. Ever since she put on the Empress Phoenix coronet, she still hadn't put on the airs that an empress should have. Since the people below didn't like her so much, she naturally had to take this opportunity to show them that she, Han Yunxi, wasn't qualified to be the empress of the Great Qin. The birthday banquet was held in the Great Qian Hall on the west side of the imperial residence. Apart from the Crepe Myrtle Hall, the Great Qian Hall was the largest hall in the imperial residence. The hall was circular and open on all 4 sides. It could accommodate 100 people. When Han Yunxi and Ning Jing arrived at the Great Qian Hall, the servants had already set up the venue. The hall was circular, and the seats were arranged in a rectangular arrangement. The east side was the main seat, and behind the main seat was a large screen. On the left and right sides of the main seat were several separate secondary seats. Next to the secondary seats were rows of seats. There were 3 rows on the left and right, and each row could accommodate 10 people. Other than that, there were no other special decorations in the hall. Ning Jing deliberately counted and whispered, 7 secondary seats. What kind of rule is this? Most banquets were very particular about the seating arrangements, not to mention the Crown Prince's first birthday banquet. Those who could sit in the second seat had to be of high rank. Even Shi and Tang Li didn't have the qualifications to do so. Han Yunxi turned around and said, Long Fei Yi. Ning Jing didn't react for a moment. She didn't understand until Han Yunxi dragged her to the kitchen. Han Yunxi meant that Long Fei Yi was the rule. In the kitchen, all the delicacies were prepared. Han Yunxi opened a lid and took a look. She immediately closed it, and revealed a satisfied smile. She instructed, "Serve the dishes according to the order I listed. Don't make any mistakes." The steward eunuch quickly nodded. "Rest assured, Your Highness the Empress. This old servant understands." The two most important things in a banquet were the venue and the dishes. After Han Yunxi looked through them, there were no problems. She found Zhao Mama and asked in a low voice, "How's the matter? Don't make a mistake." "Rest assured, Your Highness the Empress. This old servant is the best at this kind of thing." When that girl came over, this old servant knew that there was something wrong with her. Zhao Mama smiled treacherously. Ning Jing watched Zhao Mama's sinister expression from the sidelines and mused to herself, "Heaven knows how bad an old court lady like Zhao Mama would be if she hooked up with a bad master." If Han Yunxi handed all the palace maids over to her, she would definitely be able to sit back and relax. The first birthday banquet was set to start in the evening. After dark, those who were invited all entered the palace. Who dared to be late for a banquet held by the emperor and empress? Although there were many people who objected to the empress holding a grand banquet, most of the people who came brought big gifts. As the time for the banquet approached, most of the seats were filled. The main hall was bustling with noise and excitement. The invited officials, madams, and young misses were all chatting in groups of 3 to 5. Even so, everyone was still thinking about the 7 empty seats below the main seat. According to the rules, the emperor and empress were first, followed by the imperial relatives and nobles with titles, and then the ministers. There were only 5 types of titles in the Great Qin Empire: Wang Gong, Ho Bo and Nan. Those who were qualified to be invited to the palace were only Wang and Gong. The Wang titles were further divided into Qin Wang and Jun Wang. Qin Wang was also known as Wang. Generally, they were the emperor's blood brothers. Jun Wang were mostly Wang of the opposite sex. Those who had made great contributions were qualified to be conferred the title. The duke titles were also divided into 2 types, Guogong and Jun Wang. They were also used to confer titles to those who had made great contributions. In terms of status and nobility, Qin Wang was higher than Jun Wang, Jun Wang was higher than Guogong, and Guogong was higher than Jun Wang. Generally speaking, those with truly noble status were Qin Wang. Even some Jun Wang might not be able to sit on the secondary seat, let alone Guogong and Jun Wang. However, the situation in the Great Qin Empire was different. In the Great Qin Empire, only Gu held the title of Wang. He was Qin Wang Yu. The title of Jun Wang was vacant. As such, those who held the title of Wang appeared to have a much more noble status. The Great Qin Empire had 4 Guogong. They were Guogong Bailey Yuanlong, Guogong Qing Shaoan, Guogong Zhou Qichu and Guogong Ding Kalin. Among them, apart from Bailey Yuanlong, who held the position of military commander in the central region, the other 3 did not hold any positions in the imperial court. However, their influence was great. Shaoan was none other than Jiangnan's Xiao family's patriarch, Xiao Dong's uncle. He had contributed a lot of provisions to the army in the central region. During the plague in northern Li, he had contributed the most provisions. Guogong Zhou Qichu was originally a marquis of Western Zhou. Because he had led the soldiers and civilians to surrender, he was exempted from the battle in Western Zhou, and was thus given the title of Wang. As for Guogong Ding Kalin, he was the owner of a large grassland in northern Li, and controlled the best grassland in northern Li. During the chaos of the plague, he had voluntarily surrendered and saved the victims. As a result, he was given the title of Wang. The title of Wang wasn't given to a single person. It was a glory and status bestowed upon a family by the emperor. The matter of Wang was not only a reward based on merit, but it was also a form of appeasement, roping, and exploitation. For example, although Long Feiyi wanted to get rid of the Xiao family, he had to give the title of Wang first. At the very least, he had to appease the Xiao family and stabilize the Jiangnan region. According to the rules, the secondary seat below the main seat was given to those with titles. Thus, according to the Great Qin system of Wang, apart from Gu, the 4 Guogong all had the right to sit there. However, Bailey Yuanlong and the other dukedoms were arranged to sit behind the secondary seats. At this moment, Bailey Yuanlong and Shaoan were both staring at the 7 empty seats. their displeasure written all over their faces. Tang clan master, Madam Jing has arrived. Suddenly, a eunuch's loud voice rang out, causing everyone to fall silent. The Tang clan could be said to be a very special existence. The members of the Tang clan didn't have titles or official positions. Even if they controlled weapons, they didn't have military ranks. The status of being a member of the Tang clan was actually quite awkward. Moreover, when Long Fei Yi paid respects to his ancestors, he didn't confer his mother the title of Empress Dowager. Consort one could only be considered Consort Dowager. The Tang clan was Consort Dowager's maternal family, so this status really didn't count for much. Not to mention others, even Bailey Yuanlong looked down on the Tang clan. Everyone was silent as Tang Li's family of 3 walked into the main hall under everyone's watchful eyes. Tang Li actually held Ning Jing's hand in one hand, and little Tang Tang's in the other. Quite a few elders furrowed their brows, and secretly cursed him for being unruly. Tang Li led Ning Jing and little Tang Tang to the secondary seats in a carefree manner. Now the hall was even quieter. Everyone exchanged glances, and quite a few people looked towards the 4 Guogong. Tang Li's family of 3 sitting in the secondary seats was clearly looking down on the 4 Guogong's status. Bailey Yuanlong wasn't calm at all. He was about to stand up when Bailey Lixiang, who was sitting behind him, quickly held him back and whispered, "Father, don't be impatient. Look at clan head Xiao." Only then did Bailey Yuanlong sit back down and ask politely, "Tang clan head, why don't I see your father?" Tang Li was playing with his daughter when he looked over and feigned ignorance. "Official Bailey, what business do you have with my father?" Hee. Old man saw that His Majesty left a seat for the imperial uncle, so he thought he'd come. Bailey Yuanlong laughed. As soon as Bailey Yuanlong mentioned imperial uncle, many people laughed. At this moment Xiao Dong, who was sitting across from them, looked at Lord Chun, the Minister of Appointments, and smiled. "Lord Chun, when did we get a first-rank official? Why didn't you announce it? It's not good to hide something like this from everyone." Imperial uncle was both a form of address and a first-rank official's title. In terms of title, Tang Zijin was Long Fei Ye's uncle, so naturally he could be the imperial uncle. But in terms of titles, Long Fei Yi hadn't given Tang Zijin a first-rank official's title, so Tang Zijin couldn't be called the imperial uncle. Bailey Yuanlong's words were mocking Tang Li for not having the right to sit in that position. If Tang Zijin was sitting here today, he'd definitely take these words as a form of humiliation. But to Tang Li's ears, they were trying to drive a wedge between them. His big brother had only given Gu Qishao the title of Qingwang, while leaving the title of Junwang empty. There had to be a reason why he'd demoted Bailey Yuanlong and the rest to the rank of Guogong. There had to be a reason why he hadn't given any titles to the Tang sect. Although he didn't know why, he had to believe in his older brother. Ning Jing was inwardly furious, but she didn't say anything. Firstly, it wasn't convenient for her to say anything due to her background in the Ning clan. Secondly, as a woman, it wasn't appropriate for her to speak up in this kind of setting. Although Tang Li could see that these people were trying to sow discord, he couldn't find the words to refute Bailey Yuanlong's words. He couldn't say that his father hadn't been invited, could he? No matter how much internal strife there was in the Tang sect, it was still a family matter. When faced with an external enemy, they had to be united. Tang Li wasn't stupid enough to trick his father in front of outsiders. The Minister of Personnel, Lord Chun, didn't dare to say anything. Bailey Yuanlong laughed loudly. It looks like the imperial uncle won't be coming. Old man was planning to have a drink with him, hee. Xiao Dong immediately echoed. General Bailey, it looks like you're wrong. His Majesty's position isn't reserved for the imperial uncle. After all, Tang Li had never had a direct confrontation with this group of scheming and calculating people. He was quite angry and was about to explode. At this moment, the eunuch's loud voice came from outside the door. His Highness the Crown Prince has arrived. His Highness Prince Yu has arrived. Chapter 1240. The Crown Prince came? The Prince of Yu Gu Qishao came too? For a moment, everyone looked outside the hall, very surprised. Everyone thought that the crown prince would come with the emperor and empress. Who knew that he would come with Prince Yu first? This group of people was fighting for a position here. But when the crown prince and Prince Yu came, what duke, what imperial uncle, all the positions were lowered. Tang Li's face was originally full of anger, but when he heard the announcement, he was immediately overjoyed and happy. In terms of poisonous tongue, he was absolutely poisonous to the people present, but his awkward status was not to be refuted. However, when Gu came, it was different. Gu was the only prince of Great Qin. He was the head of all the titles. Gu's identity was also brought out, and everyone present had to lower themselves. For the first time, Tang Li found that he could also like Gu so much. Before the crown prince and Prince Yu came in, everyone had already stood up. When the crown prince and Prince Yu came in, everyone knelt down. This was the etiquette of this place, and Tang Li and Ning Jing were no exception. Long live His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Long live His Royal Highness Prince Yu. Gu was wearing a brand new red robe, which was specially inlaid with gold. He wore a lot of gold ornaments, even his hairpin was gold. Red and gold together, it was as tacky as it could be. However, he was able to wear these two colors with a sense of gold and luxury. He was as showy as he could be. This was specially ordered for Rue'er's first birthday banquet. He did not care about Northern Li anyway. It was his godson's birthday, so he must make the place as big as possible. The bigger the better, it must be lively. In fact, he could have arrived in Yuning last night, but because of this set of clothes, he was delayed for a night. Little Rue'er was sitting on Gu's right shoulder. He was wearing the purple robe his mother had specially prepared for him, looking extremely noble. Although he was young and had an immature appearance, he sat high above on Gu's shoulder and looked down at the people kneeling on the ground. He did not show any fear. Instead, his cold and lonely face was filled with a heroic spirit that made people not dare to look directly at him. Everyone remained kneeling as they waited for their masters to tell them to rise, but little Rue'er didn't say a word. Meanwhile, Gu Qixiao simply treated everyone as heir. All of their attention was on Tang Li's family of three. Gu carried Rue'er through the kneeling crowd and stood in front of Tang Li. He squatted down and asked suspiciously, "Tang Li, what are you doing?" Tang Li looked up and said seriously, "Salute." Gu Qixiao placed little Rue'er in the main seat, then picked up little Tang Tang to sit on one side. Rue'er immediately jumped down from his seat and squatted in front of Tang Li, looking at him with his head tilted. Everyone was kneeling, but they secretly looked up at the crown prince, not understanding what he was doing. However, when Rue'er spoke, everyone was shocked. Rue'er asked curiously, "Royal uncle, imperial father said you don't have to kneel to me." Royal uncle, not to mention the people below. Even Tang Li and Ning Jing were calm. Although royal uncle was not a title or an official, it was just a form of address. However, the title of royal uncle was far more special than imperial uncle. In the words royal relatives were the relatives of the royal family, the emperor's in-laws. Imperial relatives were the emperor's external relatives, the family of the concubines. The imperial uncle was considered an external relative, but royal uncle was an internal relative, the closest relative. This identity was much more honorable than any title present. If Long Fei Yi made Tang Li king, Bailey Yuanlong would definitely object and ask for a throne for his son. However, Rue'er called Tang Li royal uncle, so Bailey Yuanlong had nothing to say. Royal uncle was the purest form of address. If Rue'er wanted to call Tang Li royal uncle, this was Rue'er's business and the royal family's business. None of the kneeling people were related to the royal family. They were all outsiders, so who dared to say anything? Who had the right to say anything? If Bailey Yuanlong wanted to complain, he could only blame himself for not being related to the royal family. Long Fei's move had caught everyone by surprise, but none of them could oppose it. From today onwards, the Tang sect would be placed in a special position because of Tang Li's identity. The corners of Tang Li's mouth lifted, and he almost laughed out loud. His brother had put in a lot of effort. He had given him such a great benefit, and yet he had hidden it until now. He immediately pulled Ning Jing to her feet and sat back down in a dignified manner. "Oh Lord Bailey, Lord Xiao. The two of you are truly impressive. Both of you can see through His Majesty's intentions. His Majesty really didn't plan on leaving a seat for the royal uncle." Not to mention Bailey Yuanlong and Xiao Dong. Even Duke Chunguagong Xiaoen's face was gloomy and very unhappy. Tang Li sat in the secondary seat as the royal uncle, so it was perfectly justified. With his status, Tang Li was much more spirited. He cleared his throat and said loudly, "Crown Prince, it's time for the ministers to rise." Ruier had really forgotten about this matter. He wasn't used to it. Usually, when he met the people below, he would meet with his imperial father and imperial mother. When his imperial father and imperial mother told him to rise, he basically never did. Ruier returned to the main seat and said in a childish voice with a serious expression, imitating his imperial father, "All rise." "Thank you, Your Highness," everyone said in unison, and stood up one after another. They just stood there, not daring to sit. Ruier was a little confused and looked at Tang Li. Tang Li was smug and cleared his throat again. "Ahem. Crown Prince, it's time for the ministers to be seated." Only then did Ruier understand. With a domineering attitude and a childish voice, he ordered loudly, "Everyone sit down." Everyone was stunned. What was with the Crown Prince's attitude? Although they were dissatisfied, they had to cooperate. If it was normal for everyone to be seated, they would have said, "Thank you, Your Highness." However, the Crown Prince had given the order, so everyone could only nod. "Yes, Your Highness." Looking at the minister's helpless expressions, Ning Jing almost laughed out loud. She finally saw through it. This scene looked like child's play, and even a little ridiculous, but in reality, Long Fei Yi and Han Yunqi were letting Ruier take the ministers down a notch. Long Fei Yi and Han Yunqi were reminding everyone, especially Bailey Yuanlong and Xiao Dong, that the imperial family's authority was not to be challenged, and their orders were not to be disobeyed. If Bailey Yuanlong and Xiao Dong didn't know how to restrain themselves, Long Fei Yi wouldn't reason with them anymore. He wouldn't follow the rules, and would directly suppress them with his imperial power. Although Jiangnan couldn't fall into chaos right now, and although Bailey Yuanlong had a large number of troops, Long Fei Yi just didn't want war to break out again. It wasn't because he was afraid, and it wasn't because he couldn't deal with them. Even an outsider like Ning Jing could see Long Fei Yi's intention of letting Ruier go first, let alone the others present. After taking their seats, everyone looked at each other in dismay. Bailey Yuanlong and Xiaoan exchanged a few glances. Unfortunately, Bailey Yuanlong didn't quite understand Xiaoan's thoughts, and Xiaoan didn't know what Bailey Yuanlong was thinking either. It wasn't appropriate for them to speak openly in this place. And with the Crown Prince here, it was even more inappropriate for them to leave. Sitting behind Bailey Yuanlong, Bailey Lixiang saw her father and clan head Xiao exchanging flirtatious glances. But she didn't understand Xiaoan's intentions either. After a while, she stepped forward and whispered, "Father, His Majesty must have sensed that we're in contact with the Xiao clan. As I see it, we should put off the matter with Northern Li for now. Clan head Xiao should be thinking the same thing." Bailey Yuanlong would listen to his daughter. "But the matter of the birthday banquet is all the Empress's fault. This concerns the hearts of the people, we can't miss it." Bailey Lixiang whispered again. Bailey Yuanlong thought it made sense and nodded. "All right, we'll follow the original plan." At first, everyone was chatting in small groups, but once Gu and Ruier arrived, they couldn't speak carelessly. Gu Qixiao never cared who was present. He carried Ruier and little Tang Tang over, and had them sit on his left and right thighs, chuckling as he teased them. Now that Tang Li was the imperial uncle, he suddenly felt lonely at the top. With no one to provoke him, he was bored. So he brought over grapes and peeled them one by one, giving them to Ning Jing to eat. All the civil and military officials in the court looked at them quietly, no one daring to make a sound. If the Crown Prince was older, they could still flatter him. But he was only 1 year old. What could they flatter him for? They could only tease him. Who would dare? As for Tang Li, he'd just clashed with Bailey Yuanlong and the Xiao clan. Anyone who bumped into him now might end up as a punching bag. As for Gu, even Bailey Yuanlong and clan head Xiao didn't dare speak to him. As a result, everyone could only wait and wait. There was still an hour before the banquet began. Finally, someone came to save everyone. This person was none other than the Grand Tutor and head of the Imperial Physician Courtyard, Gu Beiyue. Grand Tutor Gu has arrived. Upon hearing the eunuch's announcement, Rui immediately jumped down from Gu's lap and rushed out as fast as he could. Soon, everyone saw Gu Beiyue walk in. He was still the same, wearing snow-white robes and a calm and gentle expression. He was clearly a warm person, like the spring breeze in April, but after looking at him for a long time, he was like the lonely moon in the late autumn sky, high and far unreachable. Rui hung on Gu Beiyue's back, rubbing his neck intimately. Bailey Yuanlong was convinced of Gu Beiyue's strength, even though he was a descendant of the Shadow Clan. As for clan head Xiaowen, who had opposed him in Medical City, he was not only convinced but also fearful. The two of them often thought how good it would be if Gu Beiyue wasn't a descendant of the Shadow Clan and wasn't Han Yunxi's subordinate. When Gu Beiyue arrived, the tense atmosphere disappeared. Most people stood up and bowed to Gu Beiyue. Gu Beiyue also politely returned the greeting. The Grand Tutor's rank wasn't high. Gu Beiyue bowed to those of a higher rank than him, and he was also very respectful to the four Guidukes. The four Guidukes all stood up and responded politely. Gu Beiyue had just arrived and hadn't rested for a day and night. As soon as he arrived, he heard that Gu and Rui had arrived first. He didn't even have time to see Long Fei Yi and Han Yunxi. He didn't even have time to rest and changed his clothes before coming over. Gu and Tang Li were people who didn't mind making things worse. Moreover, Rui was such a young child. How could he not worry? Chapter 1241. As soon as they saw Gu Beiyue arrive, both Gu and Tang Li were delighted and rose to their feet to welcome him. Gu Beiyue was a smart man, so his lips curved into a smile at the sight of the 7 secondary seats. He knew exactly what was going on. Although his official rank wasn't low, he still carried Rui on his back and openly sat down by Gu's side. The position of Grand Tutor was a unique one. In different countries and dynasties, their statuses and responsibilities differed. Some Grand Tutors were equivalent to the Prime Minister of a country. As the teacher of the Emperor, they could even manage the court in his place when the Emperor was young. Some Grand Tutors simply taught the Crown Prince to read and understand, but weren't allowed to involve themselves in court matters. Still others had no real power, and were nothing more than an empty title. For example, Tianning's Crown Prince Long Tianma's position of Grand Tutor was held by Tianning's Prime Minister. In truth, the Prime Minister didn't specifically assist the Crown Prince, but only occasionally gave him advice. The Grand Tutor of the Great Qin Empire was a 4th-rank official. Gu Beiyue not only taught the Crown Prince to read and understand, but was also allowed to teach him about politics. If Long Fei Yi promoted the Grand Tutor to a 1st-rank official position, heaven knows how busy Gu Beiyue would be. Would he be able to escape unscathed from the various factions in court? As a 4th-rank official, Gu Beiyue didn't have any real power. He could easily refuse anyone's attempts to form a clique and extricate himself from the complicated struggles between factions. From an outsider's standpoint, he could evaluate the high officials more objectively. He didn't have any real power, but his words to the Emperor now and the Crown Prince in the future carried a lot of weight. It was said that the words of a lowly man carried little weight, but Long Fei Yi did the exact opposite. He used this method of low position, little power, heavy words, to protect Gu Beiyue from being dragged down by the various factions. It also ensured that Gu Beiyue's advice to him and the Crown Prince would be more objective and impartial. Once the Crown Prince grew up, Gu Beiyue would be assisting Long Fei in teaching him how to judge court affairs. He'd have to judge everything from national policies to memorials. Gu Beiyue's standpoint and position would be crucial. Gu Beiyue was a 4th-rank official, but his position as the Crown Prince's teacher was special. No one present dared to express dissatisfaction with him sitting in the 2nd seat. When he saw Rui hugging Gu Beiyue without letting go, Gu was filled with envy and jealousy. While Rui wasn't paying attention, he suddenly carried Rui down and let him sit in the main seat again. Rui immediately glared at him fiercely. That gaze was exactly the same as the one Long Fei Yi used to glare at Gu. Gu Beiwa narrowed his eyes and looked over disdainfully, just like how he looked at Long Fei Yi. Gu Qixiao and Ru'er glared at each other until they were at odds. However, Gu Beiwa was shocked. He quickly carried Ru'er back and whispered, "Ru'er, you can't sit in the main seat in front of outsiders. It's a big taboo." Fortunately, the banquet hadn't started and Ru'er was still too young. No one present noticed this. Ru'er looked up and asked softly, "Why?" "You'll understand when you have brothers in the future," Gu Beiwa replied softly. "Just remember it. Grand Tutor will explain it to you in the future." Okay. Ru'er was always so obedient in front of Grand Tutor. Gu Beiwa carried Ru'er to the first seat below the main seat. He half knelt in front of Ru'er and said softly, "Sit properly, Ru'er. Ru'er, remember, the seat on your father's right is yours. No matter what happens, unless your father agrees, you can't change your seat." Ru'er nodded and asked again, "Why?" "Grand Tutor, where do you sit?" "Grand Tutor will tell you when you're older." Gu Beiwa thought for a moment and stretched out his pinky with his back to the crowd. "Ru'er, Grand Tutor will promise you that as long as you don't change your seat, Grand Tutor will always sit behind you. I won't change my seat either, okay?" Ru'er didn't hesitate to hook his pinky finger with Gu Beiwa's for a pinky promise. He said, "I want to make a promise with father too." Gu Beiwa smiled and almost reached out to rub Ru'er's head. However, he didn't. He retreated to his seat and sat down properly. At this time, Shaoan retracted his gaze. He originally wanted to let the crown prince sit in the main seat for a while before making trouble. Who knew that Gu Beiwa would come at such a coincidence? In this kind of situation, the crown prince sitting in the main seat could be a big or small matter. If it was a small matter, it would be a child being immature. If it was a big matter, it would be the Empress and Grand Tutor's fault. Although Xiao Dong and Bailey Yuanlong were prepared to impeach Han Yunqi, Shaoan had a bad feeling about today's situation. He didn't know what Bailey Yuanlong meant when he kept winking at him just now. He pondered that he would have to remain indecisive and act according to the wind. The Crown Prince and Grand Tutor each took one seat. In addition to Gu, Tang Li and Ning Jing, there were only 2 seats left. Little Tang Tang was different from Ru'er. She was held in Tang Li's arms and didn't have a seat to herself. After Gu Beiwa took his seat, many officials started chatting with him. Everyone had endless things to say to Gu Beiwa. It wasn't that they had topics to talk about with Gu Beiwa, but that they had many questions to ask Gu Beiwa. Chatting was two-sided, while asking for advice was one-sided. In terms of real chatting, only Long Fei Yi and Han Yunqi had enough brainpower to chat with Gu Beiwa. The atmosphere in the hall finally improved. Everyone wasn't so bored anymore. At first, Gu Qixiao listened on the side, but soon grew bored. The questions these officials asked were all things he didn't understand and wasn't interested in. He wanted to tease Ru'er, but Ru'er ignored him. Ru'er listened attentively to every word Gu Beiwa said. Although he didn't understand most of it, he liked listening to Grand Tutor speak. Apart from Imperial Father and Imperial Mother, Grand Tutor's voice was the best. Finally, the bored Gu got angry. Seeing that one of the officials was about to speak, he snatched the chance to pull Gu Beiwa over and whispered in his ear, "Your Excellency Gu, did you receive your lordship's wedding gift?" Seeing this, the people below didn't dare to interrupt and could only wait. "I have received it." Gu Beiwa was very calm. "Have you seen it?" Gu asked again. "I saw the cover." Gu Beiwa didn't blush, and his heartbeat didn't accelerate. He answered honestly. Gu Qixiao purposely glanced at him before he chuckled. "Do you like it?" Gu Beiwa also smiled. "Thank you for the gift." Gu looked deeply at Gu Beiwa, his face full of suspicion. This guy was such a gentleman, gentle and refined. How could he talk about that without blushing? "Gu Beiwa, I heard that Qin Min got pregnant not long after you got married. You're really something." Gu smiled ambiguously, but Gu Beiwa replied seriously, "I know a thing or two about obstetrics. Qin Min is very familiar with it." Gu spat out the tea in his mouth. Fortunately, it didn't spray on Gu Beiwa. What an obstetrics thing. No wonder Gu Beiwa was so calm. He actually attributed that thing to obstetrics. Gu looked at Gu Beiwa without moving. After a while, he rolled his eyes at Gu Beiwa. You medical nerd. Gu Beiwa said seriously. Seventh young master. You can ask me if there's anything you don't understand in the future. Gu was dispirited and didn't want to talk to Gu Beiwa at all. Boring. Gu Beiwa sat back down with his head lowered. She bit her lip and smiled unconsciously, feeling a little embarrassed. Unfortunately, it was only for a short while and Gu didn't notice. Grand Tutor Gu, where's your Qin Min? Is she here with you? Is she in the residence? Tang Li asked. Tang Li was the imperial uncle. So Ning Jing was also a relative of the imperial family. Naturally, she had the right to be seated. However, Qin Min was only Gu Beiwa's family member and didn't have the right to be invited. He didn't want to seek treatment for Ning Jing. He really didn't care how many children Ning Jing could give him. Moreover, his sister-in-law had already asked Qin Min about Ning Jing's condition, and Qin Min had also determined that it was incurable. Tang Li only wanted to see what Qin Min looked like. Gu Beiwa's taste was almost on par with his elder brother's. Qin Min should be an unusual woman no matter what. Is Madam Min feeling better? Ning Jing also asked. Not very well. She's still recuperating in Jiangnan. Time is too tight, and I can't bear to see her rushing about. Gu Beiwa replied indifferently. Is there anything wrong? Ning Jing was a little puzzled. She had been pregnant before, so she knew a lot about the situation. Gu Beiwa and Qin Min were both doctors. How could they not be able to deal with a small pregnancy reaction? It's nothing serious. She's just afraid of the cold. Gu Beiwa quickly changed the topic and chatted with the ministers below. The four Guogong, several first-rank officials, and generals were all very quiet. No one took the initiative to chat with Gu Beiwa. They were all trying to figure out who would take the remaining 2 seats. No matter how they thought about it, there were no imperial relatives in the imperial family, and no one in the imperial court was qualified to take a seat. These seats weren't randomly placed. No one could figure out the emperor's intentions. Many people even guessed that the emperor might confer 2 Junwang titles during the crown prince's birthday banquet. Finally, the eunuch outside the door shouted again. This time, the main characters had arrived. Your Majesty, Her Imperial Highness the Empress has arrived. Everyone stood up nervously and walked out of their seats to kneel in greeting. Long Fei Yi and Han Yunxi both wore purple luxurious clothes. Even in this kind of occasion, Long Fei Yi didn't forget to hold Han Yunxi's hand and intertwine their fingers. After the 2 of them took their seats, Long Fei Yi said, My beloved subjects, rise and take your seats. Everyone stood up and took their seats. The hall became even quieter. Everyone was waiting for Long Fei Yi to ask the eunuch at the side if everyone had arrived. However, Long Fei Yi didn't ask. He left the 2 secondary seats empty and turned to ask eunuchly, Prepare to start the banquet. We think everyone should be hungry. Yes. Eunuchly respectfully retreated. Not long after, 2 groups of palace maids filed out from the left and right sides of the main hall. Each of the palace maids held a tray of food. On the tray were very exquisite porcelain dishes. The dishes were covered, and the dishes couldn't be seen. However, just by looking at these dishes, it was enough to see how sumptuous today's banquet was. At this time, the Bailey father and daughter sneered. They couldn't wait for today's banquet to be more sumptuous. Chapter 1242. One by one, the palace maids filed out, serving delicacies and fine wine to every guest present. All the palace maids were dressed in the same festive colors. They had clearly been trained, their footsteps light as if they were dancing. The procession seemed to have been quietly rehearsed, one in and one out. The speed was balanced, elegant and orderly. The originally undecorated hall became lively and festive because of the dance of the palace maids. Long Fei Yi and Han Yunxi sat high up in the main seats. Long Fei Yi, who always had a cold and solemn expression, had a faint smile on his lips. He should be in an extremely good mood. Han Yunxi was actually not a person who liked to smile. But ever since she became the empress, she basically wore a harmless smile when she appeared in public. How many people in the court wanted to see her cry? So how could she not smile? At this moment, Han Yunxi's smile was very bright. looking at the palace maids coming in and out, watching the empty tables gradually being filled with large and small tableware. She became more and more satisfied. She turned back to look at Gu and asked with a smile, "Prince Yu, how is this place? This empress has carefully prepared for several days, and also spent a lot." When Han Yunqi said this, all the officials looked over. Almost everyone thought that the empress would say spent a lot of money. However, Han Yunqi said, also spent a lot of effort. Ah. Good. Excellent. Gu Qixiao replied as he clapped. If this place was prepared by someone else, he would definitely dislike it for not being grand enough, lively enough, or gorgeous enough. However, as long as it was prepared by Poison Lass, it was the best in the world. Imperial Uncle Li, what do you think? Han Yunqi asked again. No one can match the Empress's taste, Tang Li said with a smile. Of course, how can the Crown Prince's first birthday banquet be shabby? Han Yunqi pretended to be proud. Not to mention Bailey Yuanlong and the Xiao family, even the other two dukes, as well as those officials who had always respected the Empress and supported the Crown Prince, were dissatisfied. The herdsmen of Northern Li were still in dire straits. There was not much food in the national treasury that could be used for disaster relief. The common people spontaneously organized disaster relief. Han Yunqi was the mother of the country and the birth mother of the Crown Prince. How could she hold such a lively banquet at this critical juncture? Of course, everyone was angry in their hearts, but they didn't dare to say anything. Seeing the Empress look towards Gu Beiyue, everyone became expectant and waited for the Empress to ask Grand Tutor Gu. Everyone hoped that the Grand Tutor could speak out their grievances and persuade the Empress, or even the Emperor, who spoiled the Empress too much. Bailey Yuanlong's old face was gloomy, and his heart was filled with anger. If it weren't for his daughter's constant persuasion, he would have stood up to denounce Han Yunqi as soon as she arrived. At this moment he stared coldly at Gu Beiyue. He wanted to see how Gu Beiyue would evaluate this banquet. He was waiting. If Gu Beiyue objected to the Empress's actions, he would immediately stand up and agree. Bailey Lixiang was puzzled. She thought, the Emperor had listened to Han Yunqi's pillow talk and agreed to hold this banquet. Could it be that Gu Beiyue had been bewitched by Han Yunqi as well? With Gu Beiyue's personality and style, he should have stopped the Emperor and Empress long before the banquet began. Bailey Lixiang waited patiently, not forgetting to secretly tug on her father's robes to remind him to stay calm and observe the situation. There was still something fishy about this situation. She had to be on guard against Han Yunqi, setting up a trap for them. After all, Han Yunqi had cheated quite a bit of grain for the people of the disaster areas during the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet. Everyone was waiting for Han Yunqi to ask Grand Tutor Gu. But Han Yunqi only stared at Gu Beiyue for a long while before turning to look down at the crowd below without saying a word. This time, everyone lowered their heads, not daring to meet her gaze. The people sitting in the first row to the left and right were ranked in descending order of status. The 4 Guogong dukes, 3 generals, and the ministers of the other 5 ministries, besides the Ministry of War, were all seated in the first row. Almost all of them had brought their wives with them, who sat with them on the side. Bailey Yuanlong was an exception. His first wife had long passed away. Sitting next to him was Bailey Qiyu, who had been conferred the title of general. Behind him sat his eldest daughter, Bailey Lixiang, while behind Bailey Qiyu sat his wife. Han Yunqi's attention fell on Bailey Yuanlong and his family. Of the 10 empty red envelopes she'd given out, 3 were for the Bailey clan. Although the Guogong Duchess of the Bailey clan had passed away, Han Yunqi still prepared red envelopes for them. She'd sincerely wanted to give them this red envelope. Rather than saying it was out of respect and remembrance for the Duchess, it was more of a show of respect for the Bailey clan. This was a special treatment. To put it bluntly, she was telling the other 3 Guogong duchesses that the Bailey clan was different from them. However, Bailey Yuanlong and Bailey Lixiang didn't understand Han Yunqi's meaning. Their resentment only grew when they realized that the red envelopes they'd received were empty. There were also 2 red envelopes. One was for the general's wife behind Bailey Qiyu, while the other was for Bailey Lixiang. Bailey Lixiang had performed meritorious service in Northern Li as a spy, so she'd been conferred the title of first-rank madam. Bailey Lixiang's title of first-rank madam was another special treatment the imperial family had bestowed upon the Bailey clan. A first-rank madam was the highest rank among the titled madams, so they received the best treatment. Madams of the first rank were usually the mothers or wives of high-ranking officials. Bailey Lixiang was the noble consort of the Northern Dynasty's emperors, so she couldn't accept such a title at all. Long Feiyi could make her a princess or give her a large reward, but Long Feiyi had made an exception to show his special treatment of the Bailey clan. When the country was first founded, the south was strong while the north and west were filled with all sorts of unstable elements. Long Feiyi could use his power, military might, and iron-blooded policies to suppress them. But Cloud Realm continent still needed at least 3 more years to settle down before they could start rebuilding. The commoners would need at least 5 or 6 years to live a peaceful life. It'd take at least 10 or 20 years for them to prosper and prosper. Long Feiyi didn't want to waste any more time. It wasn't just his time, but the people of Cloud Realm continent. He'd spent countless days deliberating before bestowing the titles of Duke and Prime Minister. More than that, he'd spent countless nights talking with Gu Beiyue and a few of his trusted aides. In the end, they decided to wrong the Bailey clan and choose 4 clan heads from the south, west, and north to share the title of Guogong with Bailey Yuanlong. This way, the Bailey clan wouldn't be given too high of a title or salary, but would be able to highlight the status of the other 3 clans. At the very least, the other 3 clans would accept it wholeheartedly. Long Feiyi didn't tell Bailey Yuanlong the reason, because he'd wronged the Bailey clan while giving the man a test. After all, the man had disappointed him before. The result was regrettable. Even now, Bailey Yuanlong still didn't understand the special treatment he and Han Yunxi were giving him. He even colluded with the southern generals. Han Yunxi recovered from her thoughts with a smile on her face. Her gaze rested on Bailey Lixiang. That's Lixiang, right? Bailey Lixiang quickly rose to her feet. This subject's daughter, Bailey Lixiang, greets esteemed empress. Han Yunxi sized her up. She'd never seen Bailey Lixiang before, so today was the first time. It had to be said that Bailey Lixiang was much more beautiful than Bailey Mingxiang. Even at her age, she was still beautiful. But Han Yunxi could tell at a glance the difference between her and Bailey Mingxiang. Bailey Lixiang didn't have the kindness of Bailey Mingxiang, but lacked the ruthlessness of Bailey Mingxiang. Han Yunxi had seen Bailey Yuanlong's temper and brain many times. She'd always discussed with Long Feiyi how he'd become a completely different person in the past year. Why was he so much calmer and shrewder than before? Moreover, his collusion with the Southern Army was done in a rather secretive manner. They still couldn't find anything to use against him. All of this had happened after Bailey Lixiang's return. How could Han Yunxi not suspect her? Lixiang, you're very knowledgeable. You should have seen banquets even bigger than this one. Tell me, this banquet held for the Crown Prince's first birthday isn't a disgrace to him, is it? Han Yunxi said with a smile. Bailey Lixiang was indeed very knowledgeable. She'd wanted to wait a bit. But since Han Yunxi had given her the chance, she didn't mind explaining to everyone how much Han Yunxi had spent on today's banquet. So far, Han Yunxi's biggest expenditure had been on the tableware in front of everyone. Yes, this subject obeys. Bailey Mingxiang nodded and said seriously. The banquet today looked simple, but there was a lot of thought put into it. It's clear to see esteemed empress's intentions. This subject will talk about the tableware. Han Yunxi smiled and indicated for Bailey Lixiang to continue. The tableware used by His Majesty and esteemed Empress is the rarely seen glittering jewel rainbow dragon and phoenix porcelain. The entire set is divided into dragon and phoenix porcelain, with 69 pieces each, Bailey Lixiang said loudly. As soon as these words were spoken, many people present revealed looks of shock. Glittering jewel rainbow dragon and phoenix porcelain. They'd all heard of the name before, but almost no one had seen the real thing. So these 2 treasures were in the imperial family. Guogong Shaoan gave Bailey Lixiang a look of admiration. He'd had his suspicions when he saw the emperor and empress's tableware, but the tableware hadn't been fully arranged yet. There were only about 10 pieces, so he couldn't be sure. As expected, Bailey Lixiang's knowledge and eyesight were excellent. Han Yunxi clapped her hands happily. It's rare to see someone who can tell, hee. Although everyone was shocked, it was only shock. After all, the Emperor and Empress had the right to enjoy tableware of this standard. But Han Yunxi's next words immediately displeased everyone. Han Yunxi said, "Today we'll let everyone bask in the Crown Prince's glory and broaden their horizons. Later, the entire set of glittering jewel rainbow porcelain will be displayed." The entire set of glittering jewel rainbow dragon and phoenix porcelain would be displayed. That meant 69 tableware of all sizes, bowls, plates, pots, spoons, chopsticks, plates, spoons, and so on. Everything would be used. Looking at it this way, how many types of delicacies would there be tonight? In Northern Li, the soldiers were starving as they sent disaster relief. The herdsmen were starving as they sought refuge from the cold. Han Yunxi, as the Empress, actually spent so much money on a single meal? Everyone looked at each other in dismay. Some of the more upright people had already started discussing. A trace of craftiness flitted past Bailey Lixiang's eyes as she said, "The tableware used by Prince Yu and the rest is also not ordinary. Esteemed Empress is generous and bestowed everyone with tableware of great origin." Chapter 1243. Even without Bailey Lixiang's introduction, everyone could tell that the tableware in front of them was no small matter. But Bailey Lixiang's introduction still surprised everyone. For example, Bailey Mingxiang said that the second seat's tableware wasn't expensive at all. It was made of black porcelain that was hard to find even with 1,000 gold taels. There were 59 pieces in each set, and only 10 pieces of the glittering rainbow dragon and phoenix porcelain had been bestowed. Another example, Bailey Lixiang said that the tableware in the 100 or so seats below the secondary seat was made of a rare white jade porcelain. It was both jade and porcelain, and each set had a total of 55 pieces, second only to the 4 black porcelain tableware in the secondary seat. Leaving aside the value of the porcelain, there were at least tens of thousands of pieces of tableware in the hall. How much food would it take to use all these tableware? How could a single person finish dozens of servings of food? Even if Northern Li hadn't suffered a disaster, even if Great Qin didn't lack food, even if Great Qin was already a prosperous nation, there was no need to be so wasteful. Everyone's table was set with a round plate, a pair of chopsticks, and a wine cup. Aside from these 3, the rest of the tableware was used to hold the food. The palace maids brought them up one after another and placed them in front of everyone. By the time Bailey Lixiang finished speaking, the palace maids had already brought out 3 individual pots of various sizes. Each pot was covered with a lid, making it impossible to see what was inside. But they could see the steam rising from the edges of the lids and smell the fragrance. Just by smelling the aroma, everyone could basically tell that these 3 pots were filled with meat. Although Long Feiyi had announced the start of the banquet, he hadn't touched his chopsticks yet. No one else was allowed to touch them, so they could only smell the hot, fragrant food. Bailey Yuanlong and Shaoan looked stern, but their hearts were filled with excitement. Even the impatient Bailey Yuanlong was completely patient. He waited for all the dishes to be served, and for the loyal court officials to be thoroughly disappointed in Han Yunxi. He knew that the emperor was already on guard against him, so he might not be able to persuade the emperor. However, if those loyal officials also joined in, it would at least make the emperor reevaluate the woman beside him. He had long heard that the emperor had told several civil officials in the imperial study that he had changed, and that the Bailey clan was no longer the Bailey clan of the past. In that case, he would let the emperor have a look. People changed, just like Han Yunxi, who had risked her life for the sake of disaster relief. She'd changed as well. In fact, the emperor himself had also changed, hadn't he? Perhaps he was the first to change. Ever since he met Han Yunxi, he was no longer the previous master of the Bailey clan, right? Apart from Bailey Yuanlong's group, some of the ministers in the back looked at each other worriedly. They respected the empress very much, and were full of expectations. However, today's banquet had greatly disappointed them. The Crown Prince's first birthday banquet was indeed a major event, and couldn't be shameful. But these were special times, so the Empress had to restrain herself a little. Of course, everyone kept their worries to themselves. No one dared to speak up. After all, the Emperor had only said one sentence so far. No one could tell what he thought of the Empress's actions. Moreover, the banquet had only just begun. The dishes hadn't even been served yet. Even if they wanted to persuade the Empress, they had to have sufficient reasons to convince the Emperor. Apart from Long Fei Yi and Han Yunqi's confidants, the hundreds of people in the large hall were growing more and more dissatisfied with Han Yunqi. Han Yunqi ignored everyone else, her attention on Bailey Lixiang. She was growing more and more satisfied with her. She chuckled. It's rare to meet someone who knows what's good for them. Madame Lixiang, take this set meal as a reward from the Crown Prince. Bailey Lixiang hastily walked out of her seat and bowed in thanks. After Bailey Lixiang returned to her seat, the hall fell silent again. Only the palace maids continued to dance gracefully as they served the dishes. Every dish was covered and steaming hot. The aroma was enough to make anyone drool. The weather was cold, and according to the rules of the banquet, every dish had to be covered. Thus, no one suspected anything. It was already mealtime, so many people were hungry. Unfortunately, Long Fei Yi still hadn't touched his chopsticks, so everyone could only keep him company on an empty stomach. Long Fei Yi sat high up in his seat. He was less dignified than he usually was in court, but the domineering air between his brows and the noble air of a king didn't diminish in the slightest. He didn't pay much attention to the people below. Even when Bailey Lixiang explained the origin of the tableware, his doting gaze was focused on Han Yunqi. It was as if he knew Han Yunqi was fooling around, and that everyone was dissatisfied with the Empress. But he was happy to let her do as she pleased. After Bailey Lixiang sat down, she couldn't help but look at Long Fei Yi again. She'd heard all sorts of things about this master since childhood, but now she finally got the chance to meet him. He was handsome, domineering, noble and aloof. Just like any other woman who'd seen him, she'd be instantly moved. But she knew very well that she'd missed her chance more than 20 years ago. She could only blame her younger sister, Bailey Mingxiang, in her heart. After Bailey Mingxiang entered the Duke of Qin's estate as a servant, she'd had so many chances. Why didn't she seize them? Otherwise, there would have been an imperial noble concubine by this man's side today. Her Bailey clan would have gained another bargaining chip. After a long silence, everyone began to count the dishes in front of them. There were still so many dishes left to be served. His Majesty wouldn't wait until all the dishes were served before starting the banquet. Would he? Gu and Gu Beiwa had rushed over today, so they had no idea what Han Yunqi and Long Fei Yi were planning. Although Gu often ruined Long Fei Yi's plans, this banquet was Rui's, so he naturally kept his mouth shut. He sat with his arms crossed, carefully sniffing the table full of fragrances, as if he'd discovered something. But Gu Beiwa didn't seem interested in the food on the table. He stood up and broke the silence. This official has prepared a meager gift for His Highness the Crown Prince. I hope His Highness will kindly accept it. There were two ways to give gifts at birthday banquets. One was to give them before they entered the banquet, while the other was to present them. Giving gifts was the rule of ordinary households. Present gifts was the etiquette of the imperial family. Of the nearly 100 people present, those of low status had already handed over their birthday gifts to the eunuchs as soon as they'd entered the palace. As for those with high statuses, they would present gifts in front of everyone at the banquet. Generally speaking, the gifts would begin after the banquet had begun, and after 3 rounds of wine. Since Gu Beiwa had started it, and everyone was hungry, no one fussed over etiquette with Gu Beiwa. After all, there weren't many people who needed to present gifts in court. Perhaps His Majesty would start eating after the gifts were presented? Everyone was looking forward to seeing what Gu Beiwa's grand tutor would give His Highness the Crown Prince for his birthday. Gu Beiwa had someone deliver the gift, but it was none other than a giant map. He and his servants unfurled it and showed it to the Emperor, Empress and Crown Prince, as well as the various officials. The map was even taller than him, and 2 meters wide. It was a map of Cloud Realm continent. Your Highness Crown Prince, this official spent 3 months drawing this map with my own hands. It includes every county and town in Cloud Realm continent. Places prone to floods, droughts, fires, snowstorms, and other rare disasters have all been marked out. Gu Beiwa paused before sighing. This year, the Great Qin's north has been plagued by disasters. Famine, plague, and snowstorms have alternated, leaving the people in dire straits. Your Highness is 1 year old today, so this official presents this gift to the victims of the north and the people of Great Qin. May the imperial family take pity on our Great Qin and wish for no more disasters. Ru'er didn't understand, but he'd long been captivated by the map. He glanced at his imperial father, who nodded, and jumped off his seat to walk in front of the unfurled map. He was only 1 year old, and small to begin with. Standing before the map made him seem even more minuscule. But he wasn't intimidated by its size. Instead, he put his hands behind his back and raised his head to look at every spot on the map. Everyone fell silent, including Long Fei Yi and Han Yunxi. They watched Ru'er's back as he stared at the map of Great Qin with the same thought in their hearts. Time flew by in the blink of an eye. Ru'er would grow up one day and no longer look at this map. He'd stand at the peak of Great Qin and look down on the world beneath his feet. At that time, Great Qin would be a prosperous and powerful country, and there would be no more wars or disasters. In Long Fei Yi and Han Yunxi's eyes, Gu Beiwa was pinning such hopes on Ru'er. Unfortunately, many of the people present had a different understanding. In their eyes, Gu Beiwa's mention of the disaster victims at such a grand and extravagant banquet must be a way to remind the emperor and express his dissatisfaction with the empress. Bailey Yuanlong stroked his beard, thinking that he'd respected the right person after all. Of all the people in Western Qin's camp, Gu Beiwa was the only one he admired. Bailey Lixiang smiled faintly as she secretly sized up Gu Beiwa. She couldn't believe it when she heard that the medical academy's head had married a woman whose legs were crippled. Xiao Dong kept shooting looks at Xiaowen. In his eyes, since Gu Beiwa had already expressed his stance, they naturally had to strike while the iron was hot and use this chance to speak up. But Xiaowen only glared at Xiao Dong's impulsiveness with a displeased look. It was really hard to say who would be the one to take the lead, and who would be the first to stir up trouble in the coming days. Gu Beiwa had just returned to his seat when Gu presented him with the title deed to number 7 tea house, while Tang Li and Ning Jing presented him with a special concealed weapon toy. After the imperial family, it was time for the 4 Guogong to present their gifts. Bailey Yuanlong often considered himself the head of the 4 Guogong dukes. This time he was the first to stand up. Under everyone's expectant gazes, Bailey Yuanlong presented a pearl with both hands. Your Highness Crown Prince, this is this year's new white pearl from the East Sea. It's a small wish, I hope you'll kindly accept it. At this moment, everyone looked at each other in dismay, and they began to panic. Official Bailey was giving a pearl as a guogong, and a very, very ordinary one at that. What did he mean by this? He was clearly provoking the Crown Prince and Empress. Ru'er didn't understand, but he could sense that official Bailey's attitude wasn't good, so he didn't move. Bailey Yuanlong maintained his posture, but Han Yunxi's tone soon turned cold. Official Bailey, tell us, what's so special about this white pearl? Is it worth His Highness Crown Prince's goodwill? Chapter 1244. In the face of Han Yunxi's cold interrogation, Bailey Yuanlong revealed an innocent expression. It had to be said that if it weren't for his eldest daughter's repeated instructions, he wouldn't be enduring at this time, much less putting on such a pitiful appearance. He sighed helplessly. Your Majesty, there's nothing special about this pearl. The avalanche in northern Li has caused countless casualties, and the people of the Great Qin are suffering from hunger and cold. These days, the old man hasn't been able to sleep or eat. He's been constantly worried about the disaster in the north, and the soldiers who came to help. I really don't have the time to prepare an elaborate gift for the Crown Prince. Although the gift is small, this old subject's heart is sincere. This old subject and Grand Tutor Gu are of one heart. We are both victims of the disaster in the north and pray for the Great Qin's people, that the imperial family will pity us, and wish for the Great Qin to be free of calamities. Not to mention Han Yunxi and Long Fei Yi. Even those who weren't familiar with Bailey Yuanlong were surprised by his words. Bailey Yuanlong's words were full of mockery. First, he was mocking the empress for putting so much thought into preparing the crown prince's birthday celebration before the natural disaster. The empress clearly didn't care about the disaster in the north. Second, he pulled Gu Beiyue to his side and forcefully misinterpreted Gu Beiyue's true intentions in giving the map. Pulling Gu Beiyue to his side was also a mockery of Han Yunxi. No matter what, Gu Beiyue was Han Yunxi's most trusted subordinate. Third, he was forcing the crown prince to accept this small gift. If His Highness didn't accept it, that would be superficial. He only valued the gift's value and didn't understand its significance. Of course, the crown prince was still young and didn't understand anything. Bailey Yuanlong's mockery of the crown prince was also a mockery of Han Yunxi, his mother. In short, Bailey Yuanlong's words were full of mockery and refined criticism of Han Yunxi. At this moment, everyone was looking at Han Yunxi. They couldn't guess how the empress would react. Her response to Bailey Yuanlong's provocation would directly determine the attitudes of the other ministers. Han Yunxi was silent for a long time. Her face gradually became gloomy. The entire place was silent. No one made a sound. At this moment, Long Fei Yi opened his mouth and said, "A great gift is a great gift. Crown Prince, aren't you going to accept Duke Zhen's gift?" "Yes." Rueyer's voice was childish, but his eyes were serious. He personally walked down to stand in front of Bailey Yuanlong. Bailey Yuanlong was both surprised and delighted. He quickly knelt down and presented the gift with both hands. At this time, all the ministers were beaming with joy. The emperor was indeed wise. Since the emperor had already spoken, what were they afraid of? Of course, he had to be straightforward. As a result, Duke Qing Shaoan also stood up and presented a small gift. He spoke of the country's righteousness and concern for its people, similar to Bailey Yuanlong's. While expressing her worries, she also mocked Han Yunxi. The other two dukes also presented their gifts, but they weren't small or large. They didn't mock the empress, nor did they have any hidden meanings in their words. Instead, they congratulated her according to the rules. After the four dukes, it was time for the first-rank officials. Only two of these first-rank officials presented their gifts according to the rules. The rest followed Bailey Yuanlong's example and denounced the empress with sarcasm. Han Yunxi sat motionless with an expressionless face. Seeing her sullen appearance, Bailey Yuanlong finally felt the pent-up frustration in his heart dissipate. Shaoan's lips curled into a cold smile. He never cared whether Long Fei Yi was forced to slap the empress's face for the sake of the big picture, or whether he really couldn't stand the empress's first birthday banquet. He only knew that once there was an opening, it wouldn't be difficult to follow. If there was a first time, there would definitely be a second and third time. After the gifts were presented, Han Yunxi's face was still sullen. She swept a glance at the table and reminded him unhappily, "Your Majesty, the dishes have all been served. Please eat." The dishes today were all personally prepared by Qinxia. Bailey Yuanlong was about to stand up when Bailey Lixiang pulled him back. Bailey Lixiang was still very cautious. Long Fei Yi nodded, and Han Yunxi ordered the court ladies on the side to serve them. Under everyone's gaze, the court ladies respectfully opened the largest porcelain pot on Long Fei Yi's table. As soon as the lid was lifted, steam wafted out, accompanied by a sweet fragrance. This was a smell Long Fei Yi was very familiar with, the smell of old hen soup. The court ladies carefully filled a bowl and placed it in front of Long Fei Yi before withdrawing. "Your Majesty, this is a whole chicken soup made from 3-year-old hens, mixed with 100-year-old snow ginseng and many other precious herbs. It's been simmering since this morning. This soup contains the essence of both chicken and herbs. For this dish, you only drink the soup and don't eat the meat." Han Yunxi introduced seriously, her mood much better. Long Fei Yi looked down at the chicken soup in front of him with furrowed brows. He didn't move for a long time, as if thinking about something. Everyone sighed in their hearts. A small pot of soup used a chicken, and a lot of expensive herbs. Just this dish alone used more than 100 old hens. How much food would they consume if they were to finish the entire meal today? How much silver? Everyone couldn't help but look at the steaming pot of soup in front of their tables. They really wanted to take a look. But His Highness hadn't moved yet, so they couldn't move. At this moment, Bailey Lixiang gave the latter's servant a look, then gave her father a light kick. It was finally time to make a move. It wasn't a big deal to dislike the gifts for being too small. However, such extravagance and waste was solid evidence that everyone could see for themselves. Han Yunxi, even if His Majesty wants to protect you this time, he might not be able to. Bailey Yuanlong immediately stood up, walked out of his seat, and knelt down on both knees. In an instant, the entire hall fell into a deathly silence. Bailey Yuanlong, what are you doing? Long Feiyi spoke up. This old subject asks Your Majesty, Empress, and His Highness the Crown Prince to forgive this old subject. Bailey Yuanlong said loudly. What crime have you committed? Long Feiyi asked again. Today is the Crown Prince's first birthday, so it should be lively and festive. Esteemed Empress is holding a birthday banquet for the Crown Prince, and inviting important officials for a joyous occasion. However, the commoners in the north haven't been able to eat their fill, and the soldiers who came to relieve the disaster are also starving. This old subject's heart is bitter, unable to enjoy such a feast. This old subject earnestly asks Your Majesty to allow this old subject to withdraw. Leave. Everyone knew that official Bailey was going to denounce the Empress, but they didn't expect that he wouldn't be as fierce and direct as before. Instead, he was begging the Emperor to allow him to leave to express his anger. This wasn't just expressing his anger, but also throwing the difficult problem to the Emperor. To put it more bluntly, he was threatening the Emperor. He was threatening the Emperor to make a choice on the spot. Accept the Empress' extravagance and waste, and ignore the disaster victims, or accept his advice. If the Emperor allowed him to withdraw, then he would be condoning the Empress's absurd actions in front of everyone. The Emperor would definitely be implicated and lose the hearts of his subjects. If the Emperor didn't allow him to withdraw, then he would definitely argue with reason and force the Emperor to punish the Empress in order to appease the hearts of his subjects. Han Yunxi sat quietly in the silence. Long Feiyi was also very quiet as he looked at Bailey Yuanlong. Your Majesty, please allow this old subject to withdraw. Bailey Yuanlong said again. This time, several officials from the Bailey camp all stood up and knelt with Bailey Yuanlong, saying in unison, Your Majesty, this subject is worried about the disaster victims in the north and has no heart to enjoy today's feast. We earnestly ask Your Majesty to allow this subject to withdraw. Long Feiyi's brows furrowed at this. To the side, Gu narrowed his eyes. He hadn't taken the Bailey clan seriously before, but today was the first time he had seriously slapped Bailey Yuanlong's face. Gu Beiwa lowered his head and didn't say anything. At this time, many people were staring at him, waiting to see where he stood. Bailey Mingxiang, who was kneeling behind Bailey Yuanlong, stole a glance at Xiao Dong. He was a bit anxious. They'd agreed to move together, but the Xiao family hadn't moved. What was the meaning of this? Seeing that the Emperor hadn't said anything, Bailey Yuanlong knelt for the third time and begged, Please allow this, Your Majesty. At this time, many of the upright and loyal officials also stood up and knelt behind Bailey Yuanlong. They hadn't been involved in the struggle between factions and had always supported the Empress and Crown Prince. However, they were disappointed this time. Their actions weren't in line with Bailey Yuanlong, but to make their stance clear, the only reason they hadn't stood up immediately was because their ranks were lower, and they didn't have much influence. Now that so many high-ranking officials had stood up, they naturally had to join in. They didn't say much and kowtowed one after another. Your Majesty, please allow this subject to withdraw. At this time, Long Feiyi looked at the motionless Xiao and Duke Ding. Do you want to stay? Xiaoan felt that this matter wasn't simple, but he couldn't find anything wrong. No matter how powerful Han Yunxi was, there were still times when she was muddle-headed and arrogant. Xiaoan hurriedly got up and walked to the center of the hall, kneeling next to Bailey Yuanlong. Your Majesty, please allow this old subject to withdraw. Seeing this, Xiao Dong and some of the Xiao family's henchmen also knelt. In a short while, 2/3 of the several hundred people in the hall had knelt. Long Feiyi still didn't express his stance. He looked pensively at those who hadn't knelt. Time slowly passed. Everyone waited for Long Fei Ye's decision. At this time, a eunuch hurriedly walked over and whispered in Long Fei Ye's ear. Your Majesty, many commoners have gathered at the north and south gates. The leaders are all scholars, and they're denouncing Her Majesty the Empress. Long Fei Ye suddenly glared at him. What did they say? The eunuch jumped in fright. His legs turned to jelly, and he fell to his knees with a plop. Speak. Long Fei Ye said sternly. They said that Her Majesty the Empress held a banquet for the Crown Prince's first birthday, and was extravagant and wasteful, ignoring the disaster victims. No. The eunuch was so scared that his tongue was tied. She's not fit to be the Empress. No, she's not fit to be the mother of the heir apparent. Extravagant and wasteful? Long Fei Ye sneered. Is there such a thing, Her Majesty? Wasn't this the truth in front of their eyes? Was there a need to ask? Everyone in the hall was alarmed and disappointed. The commoners were already making a fuss. Was the emperor still insisting on indulging the empress? Han Yunxi exhaled and left the banquet. She pulled Rui to kneel in front of Long Fei Ye. Your Majesty, there's no such thing. Xinxia has been wrongly accused. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.